Welcome to Audiobook Odyssey, where we bring the magic of literature to your ears, absolutely free. This channel is dedicated to education and insight, offering key concepts and summaries of books from across genres. Whether you're diving into a timeless classic or discovering something new, we've got you covered. If you'd like to support us, consider buying me a coffee, buying a book, or even sending via UPI. Links are in the description. Don't forget to subscribe and join our growing family of listeners. So, without further delay, let's dive into the ocean of words and begin our journey through the pages of today's featured book. Chapter 21. So what could have been foreseen but not prevented had happened. Frida had left him. That needn't necessarily be final. It wasn't as bad as all that. Frida could be won back. She was easily influenced by strangers and definitely by those assistants who thought that Frida was in the same situation as they were and that now they had given in their notice. Frida must do the same. But Kay had only to appear in person, remind her of all the points in his favor, and she would be remorseful and go back to him, particularly if he could justify his visit to the girls by showing her that he had succeeded in something and owed it to them. However, although he tried to reassure himself with these reflections when he thought of Frida, he was not in fact reassured. Only a little while ago he had praised Frida to Olga, saying that she was his only prop and stay, but she was not a very steady prop and stay. It did not take some powerful man to intervene and rob him of Frida, only that not very appetizing assistant, a specimen of humanity who sometimes gave the impression of not being properly alive. Jeremias had already begun moving away, and Kay called him back. Jeremias, he said, I will be perfectly open with you, so please answer one question honestly yourself. We aren't master and servant anymore, and you are not the only one to be glad of it, so am I, which means we have no reason to deceive each other. Here before your eyes I break the switch I had intended for you. I took the way through the garden not for fear of you, but to take you by surprise and give you a taste of the switch. Well, don't bear me a grudge, that's all. Over now. If the authorities hadn't forced you to be my servant, if you'd only been an acquaintance of mine, I am sure we would have got on very well, even if your appearance does bother me a little at times. And now we can make up for our omissions in that respect. Do you think so? Said the assistant, rubbing his tired eyes and yawning. I could explain the whole thing to you in more detail, but I don't have the time. I must go to Frida. The child's waiting for me. She hasn't gone back to work yet. She wanted to immerse herself in work at once, probably to forget you, but I persuaded the landlord to give her a little time to recover, and we will at least spend that time together. As for your idea, I certainly have no reason to lie to you, but I have no reason to confide in you either. I'm not the same as you see. As long as I was your servant, of course you were a very important person to me, not on account of your own qualities, but because of my job as a servant, and I would have done anything you wanted, but now you are a matter of indifference to me. I'm not touched by your breaking that switch either. It only reminds me what a rough master I had, so it's no use trying to win me over that way. You speak to me like that, said Kay, as if you were perfectly certain you'd never have anything to fear from me again. But that isn't the case. You're probably not free of me yet. Things aren't done at such speed here. Sometimes they're done even faster, protested Jeremias. Sometimes, said Kay, but there's nothing to suggest that this is one of those times. At least, neither you nor I have written notice of the termination of your job in our hands. So the procedure is only just starting, and I haven't yet intervened through my own connections, but I will. If the outcome is not in your favor, well, you didn't do much beforehand to ingratiate yourself with your master, and I may even have been over hasty in breaking that willow switch. And you may be puffed up with pride after stealing Frida from me, but in spite of the respect I feel for your person, even if you feel none for mine anymore, I know that if I say a few words to Frida, they will be enough to tear apart the web of lies you wove to catch her. For Only lies could turn Frida against me. Those threats don't alarm me, said Jeremias. You don't want me as an assistant, you're afraid. Of me as an assistant, you're afraid of assistants in general. It was only out of fear that you hit that good soul Artur. Maybe, said Kay. But did it hurt him any less because of that? Perhaps I'll get many similar chances yet to show how afraid I am of you. I see that you don't enjoy being an assistant, and for my part one really enjoy forcing you to be one. Never mind any fear of you I may have. In fact, I shall be quite pleased to have you as my assistant on your own this time without Artur. Then I can devote more attention to you. Do you think, said Jeremias, that I'm in the least afraid of all that? Well, said Kay, you're certainly a little afraid, and if you have any sense you're very afraid. Why else haven't you gone to Frida already? Tell me, do you love her? Love, said Jeremias. She's a good, clever girl, a former lover of clams, which makes her someone to be respected anyway. And if she keeps begging me to free her from you, why shouldn't I do her the favor? Particularly as I'm not even doing you any harm. Now that you've found consolation with Barnabas's wretched sisters. Now I see your fear, said Kay. And a pitiful fear it is too. You're trying to entangle me in your lies. Frida asked me for just one thing, to set her free from my servile, lascivious assistants who had run so wild. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to finish doing as she asked, and now I see the consequences of omitting to do so. Mr. Land Surveyor, sir, Mr. Land Surveyor, someone shouted. Down the road. It was Barnabas. He arrived out of breath but didn't forget to bow to Kay. I've succeeded, he said. Succeeded in what? Asked Kay. You mean you've delivered my request to Clam? Not that, no, said Barnabas. I tried hard, but it just couldn't be done. Pushed my way to the front. I stood there all day uninvited, so close to the lectern that once a clerk actually pushed me aside because I was standing in his light. I tried to attract attention, which is strictly forbidden, by raising my hand when Clam looked up. I stayed in the office longer than anyone. In the end, I was alone there with the servants, and then I had the pleasure of seeing Clam come back again. But it wasn't because of me, he just wanted to look something up in a book, and then he left directly. At last, as I still didn't move, a servant practically swept me out of the doorway with his broom. I'm telling you all this to make sure you aren't dissatisfied with what I've done again. What use is all your industry to me, Barnabas said. Kay. If you weren't successful? Oh, but I was successful, said Barnabas. When I left my office, well, I call it my office, I saw a gentleman coming slowly along, apparently from the corridors, for they're inside the building. Otherwise the place was empty. It was already very late. I decided to wait for him. It was a fine opportunity to stay there. In fact, I felt like staying there forever rather than have ing to bring you bad news. But it was worth waiting for the gentle man anyway, because he was Erlanger. Asterisk, don't you know him? He's one of Clam's principal secretaries. A slight little gentleman with a bit of a limp. He recognized me at once. He's famous for his memory and his knowledge of human nature. He simply frowns, and that's enough for him to recognize anyone, often including people he's never met before, people he's only heard or read about, and he can't very well ever have seen me, for instance. But even though he recognizes everyone at once, he starts by asking questions as if he wasn't sure. Aren't you Barnabas? He said to me. Then he asked, you know the land surveyor, don't you? And then he said, this is handy. I'm just going to the castle inn. Tell the land surveyor to call and see me there. I'll be in room 15, but he'll have to come at once. I have only a few hearings to conduct there, and I'll be going back at 5 in the morning. Tell him I am very anxious to speak to him. Suddenly Jeremias set off at a run. Barnabas, who had hardly noticed him before in his excitement, asked, what's up with Jeremias? He wants to get to Erlanger ahead of me, said Kay. Running after Jeremias himself. He caught up with him took his arm firmly and said, "Is it desire for Frida that's come over you all of a sudden? I feel exactly the same, so we'll go at the same pace." A small group of men stood outside the dark castle, in 2 or 3 of them carrying lanterns so that you could make out many of their faces. Kay saw only one man he knew, Gerstacker the carrier. Gerstacker greeted him with the words, "So you're still in the village, are you?" "Yes," said Kay. "I'm here indefinitely." "Well, that's nothing to do with me," said Gerstacker, coughing hard and turning to the others. Turned out that they were all waiting for Erlanger. Erlanger had arrived, but he was still talking to Momus before receiving the other members of the public. The general conversation turned on the fact that they weren't allowed to wait inside the inn, but had to stand out here in the snow. To be sure, it wasn't very cold, but all the same it was thoughtless to leave them waiting outside the house in the night, perhaps for hours. Of course, that was not Erlanger's fault. He was said to be very easygoing. He probably hardly knew about it, and would certainly have been very angry if he had been told. It was all the fault of the landlady of the Castle Inn, who, in her neurotic ing for refinement, didn't want so many members of the public in the Castle Inn all at once. If we must have them here, if they really must come, she was in the habit of saying, then for heaven's sake let them come one after another, and she had carried her point, so the bears of the public, who at first just waited in a corridor, had to wait on the stairs later, then in the front hall, finally in the bar, and last of all they were thrown out into the street. Even that wasn't enough for her. She found it intolerable to be always under siege, as she put it, in her own house. She couldn't understand why members of the public had to come there at all. To make the steps outside the house dirty, an official had once said in answer to her question. He probably spoke in anger, but she had found the idea very plausible and liked. To quote his remark, she was trying to get a building put up opposite the Castle Inn where members of the public could wait, which in fact would suit their own wishes very well. She would have liked it best of all if discussions with the members of the public and hearings had taken place entirely away from the Castle Inn, but the officials opposed any such idea, and if the officials seriously opposed it, then of course the landlady couldn't win, although she did exercise a kind of little tyranny in minor matters, thanks to her tireless yet softly feminine zeal. However, it looked as if the landlady would have to continue putting up with discussions and hearings at the Castle Inn, for the gentlemen from the castle declined to leave the inn to go about their official business when they were in the village. They were always in a hurry, and anyway they came to the village only very much against their will. They had not the faintest desire to prolong the time they spent here beyond what was strictly necessary, so they could not be expected to move temporarily over the street with all their papers, thus losing time just for the sake of peace and quiet in the Castle Inn. They liked best to do official business in the bar or in their rooms, if possible during a meal, or from their beds either before going to sleep or in the morning when they felt too tired to get up and wanted to lie in bed a little longer. However, the question of erecting a building where they could wait seemed to be approached a happy solution, although of course it was a real trial for the landlady. People laughed about that a little, because the building of such a place in itself made many discussions necessary, and the corridors of the inn were hardly ever empty. The people now waiting were discussing all these things under their breath. It struck Kay that while there was plenty of grumbling here, no one had any objection to Erlanger's summoning members of the public in the middle of the night. He asked about that and was told that in fact they ought to be very grateful to Erlanger. Apparently, it was solely his own good nature and his elevated concept of his office that moved him to come down to the village at all. If he had wanted, he could have sent some undersecretary to take down statements instead, which in fact might have been more in line with the regulations. But he generally refrained from doing so. He wanted to see and hear everything for himself, although it meant giving up his nights for the purpose because no time for visits was provided in his official timetable. K objected that Clam too came to the village by day and even spent several days on end here. Was Erlanger, who was only of secretarial rank, more indispensable up at the castle? A few good-natured people laughed, while others preserved an awkward silence. The latter were in the majority, and no one seemed inclined to answer K's question. But one man did say hesitantly, well, of course Clam was indispensable in the castle and the village alike. Then the door of the inn opened, and Momus appeared between two servants carrying lamps. The first to be admitted to Mr. Secretary. Erlanger, he said, are Gerstacker and K. Are those two here? They said they were, but then Jeremiah slipped into the house ahead of them, saying, I'm the room service waiter here, and was greeted by Momus with a pat on the back. I see I'll have to keep a closer eye on Jeremias, said K to himself, although he was aware that Jeremias was probably far less dangerous than Artur, who was intriguing against him up in the castle. Perhaps it was actually wiser to let the assistants pester him than to allow them to wander around unchecked, free to hatch the plots that they seemed to delight in so much. When K passed Momus, the latter acted as if he only now recognized him. Ah, the land surveyor, he said. The man who was so unwilling to answer questions is now anxious for a hearing. You'd have had an easier time of it with me. Ah, well, it's difficult to choose the right hearing. And when, at these words, K was about to stop dead, Momus said, go along in. I could have done with your answers then. I don't need them anymore now. All the same, K, nettled by the attitude of Momus, said, you none of you think of anything but yourselves. I'm not answering questions just because you're officials either then or now. Well, who else would we be thinking of, said Momus. Who else matters here? Go along in. A servant received them in the front hall and led them the way that K already knew, across the yard, then through the gate and into the low corridor that sloped slightly down. Obviously only the higher-ranking officials stayed on the upper floors, while the rooms for the secretaries, even Erlanger, who was one of the most important of them, lay off this corridor. The servant extinguished his lantern, for there was bright electric light here where everything was built on a small scale but delicately designed. The best possible use was made of the space. You could only just walk upright along the corridor. Door after door opened off the sides of it, all the doors close to each other, and the walls did not go all the way up to the ceiling, ably for ventilation, since there were probably no windows in the little rooms off this low-lying, cellar-like passage. The disadvantage of the gap at the top of the walls was that the corridor, and inevitably the rooms too, were noisy. Many of the rooms seemed to be occupied, and the occupants of most of these were still awake, for voices, hammer blows, and the clinking of glasses could be heard. However, there was no impression of any particular merriment. The voices were muted. You could catch a word here and there, and no conversations seemed to be going on. The voices were probably just dictating or reading something aloud. No words were spoken in the rooms, where the clink of plates and glasses could be heard, and the hammer blows reminded K of something he had once been told. Many of the officials, as a means of relaxation after their constant intellectual efforts, like to go in for hobbies like joinery, precision, engineering, and so on. The corridor itself was empty, except for a tall, pale, lean gentleman who was sitting outside one door wearing a fur coat with his nightclothes showing under it. He had probably found it too stuffy in the room, so he was sitting outside reading a newspaper, but not very attentively. He often stopped reading with a yawn and then leaned forward to look down the corridor. Perhaps he was expecting a member of the public whom he had asked to come and see him, and who was late. When they had passed him, the servant said to Gerstacker, referring to the gentleman, "That's Pinsgauer." Gerstacker nodded. "He hasn't been down here for a long time," he said. No, indeed, not for a long time, agreed the servant. Finally they came to a door that looked no different from the rest. Although, as the servant informed them, Erlanger was staying in the room behind it. The servant got Kay to raise him on his shoulders and then looked down into the room through the space above the corridor wall. He's lying on his bed, said the servant, clambering back down to the floor, fully clothed, but I think he's asleep. Sometimes weariness overcomes him in the village. It's the different way of life. Here, we'll have to wait. He'll ring the bell when he wakes up. Known him to sleep away his entire visit to the village, and then have to go back to the castle as soon as he woke again. After all, it's voluntary work he does down here. Let's hope he has his sleep out. Then, said Gerstacker, because if he has any time left for work after he wakes up, he'll be very cross that he fell asleep. He'll try to get everything done in a hurry, and will hardly have any chance to say a thing. You've come about a permit for the rights to work as a carrier for the building site, have you? Asked the servant. Gerstacker nodded, drew the servant aside, and spoke to him quietly, but the man was hardly listening. He looked beyond Gerstacker, for he was more than a head taller, and gravely and slowly ran his hand over his hair. Chapter 22. Then, looking aimlessly around, Cabe saw Frida in the distance, at a turn in the corridor. She acted as if she didn't recognize him, and just looked blankly at him. She was carrying a tray of empty dishes. He told the servant, although the man didn't seem to be attending to him. The more you spoke to this servant, the more his mind appeared to be elsewhere, that he would be back in a minute, and walked towards Frida. On reaching her, he grasped her by the shoulders as if taking possession of her again, asked a few trivial questions, and looked searchingly into her eyes. But her rigid bearing hardly changed. She absently tried rearranging the china on the tray several times and said, "What do you want from me? Go back to those, well, you know their names. You've just come from them, I can tell that. You have." Kay hastily changed the subject. He didn't want this subject to be broached so suddenly, and to begin in the worst, least pro-ing way possible for him. "I thought you'd be in the bar," he said. Frida looked at him in surprise, and then gently passed her one free hand over his forehead and cheek. It was as if she had forgotten what he looked like, and did that to recall him to her mind. Her eyes, too, had a veiled look of appearing to remember something with difficulty. "Yes, I've been taken back to work in the bar," she said slowly, as if it didn't matter what she said. But beneath the words she spoke, she was conducting another and more important conversation with Kay. "The work down here isn't fit for me. Any girl can do it. Anyone who can make a bed and look friendly and doesn't fear the pestering of the guests but actually invites it can be a chambermaid. But a barmaid is a different matter. I was taken back at once to work in the bar, although I left the post in circumstances that weren't very creditable, but of course this time I had protection. And the landlord was glad I had protection, which made it easy for him to take me back. Was almost as if they had to press me to take the job, and if you stop to think what the bar reminds me of, you'll understand why. But in the end I accepted. I'm just helping out as a chambermaid." Peppy asked them not to shame her by making her leave the bar at once. "So, since she's been working hard and done everything as well as she was able, we've given her 24 hours grace. That's all very efficiently arranged," said Kay. "But you once left the bar for my sake. And are you going back there now, just before our wedding?" "There isn't going to be any wedding," said Frida. "Because you think I was unfaithful?" asked Kay. Frida nodded. "Look here, Frida," said Kay. "We've often talked about this supposed unfaithfulness of mine, and in the end you always had to acknowledge that your suspicions were unjust. Nothing has changed since then so far as I'm concerned. Everything is as innocent as ever, and that can't change either. So, there must have been some change on your part because of rumors whispered by other people, or perhaps another reason. You do me Wrong anyway, for what do you think my feelings are for those two girls? One of them, the dark one. I am almost ashamed to have to defend myself in such detail, but you make me, I probably find the dark girl's company as awkward as you do. If I can avoid her, then I do, and that suits her as well. No one could be more reserved. Yes, cried Frida, and the words burst out as if against her will. Kay was glad to see her mind diverted from the subject. She wasn't acting as she had intended. You may think her reserved, you call that most shameless of all women reserved, and incredible as it may be, you mean it. You are not pretending, I know that. The landlady of the Bridge Inn says of you, I can't stand the man, but I can't leave him to his fate either. When you see a small child who can't walk very well, yet venturing too far, you can't help yourself, you have to do something about it. Well, take her advice this time, then, said Kay. Smil, Angie, we can leave that girl right out of it, whether she's reserved or shameless. I don't want to know about her, but why do you call her reserved? Frida persisted. Kay thought this attitude of hers a good sign for him. Have you tried making approaches, or do you want to run others down by saying so? Neither, said Kay. I'm just glad I can describe her as reserved because she makes it easy for me to ignore her, and if she were to accost me frequently, I couldn't bring myself to go back there, which would be unfortunate since I have to go there on account of our joint future, as you know. That's why I have to talk to the other girl, and while I appreciate her efficiency, circumspection, and lack of egotism, no one can call her a temptress. The servants think otherwise, said Frida. In that and in much else, said Kay. Are you going to conclude that I'm unfaithful because the servants give their lust free rein? Frida did not reply, and allowed Kay to take the tray from her, put it on the floor, link arms with her, and begin slowly walking up and down the small space in her company. You don't know what it means to be faithful, she said, pulling slightly away from him. The way you may behave with those girls isn't the main thing. You're going to see that family at all, and coming back with the smell of their living room on your clothes shames me beyond bearing. And then you leave the school without a word, and you stay half the night with them, and when someone comes looking for you, you get the girls to deny that you are there, to deny it silently, especially the one who's so wonderfully reserved. You slink out of the house by a secret way, perhaps to spare the reputation of those girls. The reputation of those girls, indeed. No, let's not talk about it anymore. No, let's not talk about that, agreed Kay. But about something else. You're right, there's no more to be said on that subject. You know why I have to go there. It isn't easy for me, but I overcome my feelings. You shouldn't make it harder for me than it is already. Today I meant to call just for a minute and ask whether Barnabas was home at last, because for a long time he's been supposed to be bringing me an important message. He hadn't returned, but I was credibly assured that he was bound to be home soon. I didn't want to have him following me back to the school in order to spare you his presence. Well, the hours passed by, and I'm afraid he didn't come, but someone else did, someone I hate. I didn't want to have him spying on me, so I left through the garden of the house next door, but I wasn't going to hide from him either, and instead I went openly out on the road, carrying, I admit, a very flexible willow switch. That's all, so there's no more to be said about that either, although again there is something else to add. What about those assistants, mention of whom I find almost as repellent as mention of that family is to you? Compare your relationship with them and my conduct towards that family. I understand your dislike of the family and can share it. I visit them only for the sake of our cause, and sometimes I almost feel that I'm exploiting them and doing them wrong. But what about you and the assistants? You don't deny that. They are pursuing you, and you've admitted that you are attracted to them. I wasn't angry with you for that. I saw that there are forces beyond your control at work here. I was happy to think that at least You were resisting, I helped to defend you, and just because I neglected to do so for a couple of hours, trusting in your constancy. And, moreover, in the hope that the place was firmly locked up and the assistants finally put to flight, I'm afraid I keep underestimating them, just because I neglected our defense for a couple of hours, and that man Jeremias, who when you look at him closely is not very healthy and is getting on in years, had the gall to go up to the window. Am I to lose you just for that, Frida, and be greeted with the news that there isn't going to be any wedding? Shouldn't I be the one to feel I might reproach you? But I don't know, I still don't reproach you. Once again, it seemed a good idea to Kay to take Frida's mind off the subject, so he asked her to bring him something to eat, since he hadn't eaten anything since midday. Obviously, relieved by such a request, Frida nodded and went off to fetch something, going not further along the corridor in what Kay expected to be the direction of the kitchen, but down a couple of steps to one side. She soon brought back a plate of sliced cold meats and a bottle of wine, but these looked like the remains of someone else's supper. The slices of meat had been rearranged in a hurry to disguise the fact, but there were even some sausage skins left on the plate, and the bottle was 3/4 empty. However, Kay said nothing about that and set about his meal with a hearty appetite. "Did you go to the kitchen?" he asked. "No, to my room," she said. "I have a room down here." "Well, you might have taken me with you," said Kay. "I'll go along there now so that I can sit down while I eat." "I'll bring you a chair," said Frida, and was on her way again. "No, thank you," said Kay. "Hold, Angie her back. I won't go down there after all, nor do I need a chair now." Frida bore his grip on her with an expression of defiance, with her head bent and biting her lip. "Very well, yes, he's down there," she said. "What else did you expect? He's lying in my bed, he caught a chill outside, he's freezing, he could hardly eat a thing. Basically, it's all your fault. If you hadn't chased the assistants away and gone running after those people, we could be sitting peacefully in the school house now. You're the one who's destroyed our happiness. Do you think that as long as he was in your service, Jeremias would have dared to run off with me? If so, you don't understand the way things work here in the slightest. He wanted to be near me, he was in torments, he lay in wait for me, but that was just a game, like a hungry dog playing about yet not daring to jump on the table. And it was the same with me. I was attracted to him, he was my playmate in our childhood days. We played together on the slopes of Castle Mount. Ah, happy days! You've never asked me about my past life. But none of that mattered as long as Jeremias was kept in check by his service to you, for I knew my duty as your future wife. But then you go driving the assistants away and boasting of it too, as if you'd done it all for me, which in a certain sense is true. Your intentions worked with Artur, although only for the time being. He is a sensitive soul, he doesn't have the passion of Jeremias, who fears no difficulty. You almost killed Artur with that blow of your fist in the night. It was a blow struck against our happiness too. He fled to the castle to complain, and although he may be back soon, he's not here now. Jeremias, however, stayed. While he's on duty, he fears the merest flicker of his master's eyes, but off duty he fears nothing. He came and took me away when you had abandoned me, under my old friend's influence. I couldn't help myself. I didn't unlock the school door, he broke the window and helped me out. We fled here, the landlord respects him, and the guests will be delighted to have such a good waiter on room service, so we were taken in. He isn't living with me, but we share the same room. In spite of everything, said Kay, I'm not sorry I drove the assistants away from my service. If the relationship was as you describe it, then it was as well for everything to come to an end. Our happiness wouldn't have been very great in a marriage where two beasts of prey who duck only under the lash were also present. So I am grateful to that family too, since they unintentionally played their part in separating us. They fell silent and went on walking up and down No one could have said who had begun it. Frida, beside Kay, seemed cross that he did not take her arm again. So everything would be all right, Kay went on, and we could part and go away, you, to your new master Jeremias, who probably still has a chill from the school garden, considering that perhaps you've left him alone too long. I to go back to the school on my own, or, since I have no Boosie, nest there without you somewhere else, anywhere they will take me. And if I hesitate all the same, it's because I still have good reason to doubt what you've told me a little. I get quite the opposite impression of Jeremias. All the time he was in my service he was after you, and I don't think being on duty would have kept him forever from attacking you in earnest. But now that he thinks his service to me is over, it's different. Forgive me if I put it like this. Since you are not his master's fiancé anymore, you are not such a temptation to him as you were before. You may be his childhood sweetheart, but in my opinion, although I really know him only from a short conversation last night, he doesn't place much value on such emotions. I don't know why he seems to you passionate. His way of thinking strikes me as particularly cool. As far as I'm concerned, he was given a job by Gallater which was not, perhaps, very much to my liking. He tried to carry it out with a certain devotion to duty, yes, that I will admit it isn't so very rare here, and part of it was to destroy our relationship. He may have tried that in various ways, one of them being to tempt you by his lustful behavior, another, and here the landlady supported him, to tell lies about my unfaithfulness. He succeeded in his attempt. Some kind of memory of Clam clinging to him may have helped. He did lose his post, but perhaps at the very moment when he didn't need it anymore, and now he harvests the fruits of his labors by helping you out of the school window. But with that, his work is over. He's not devoted to duty anymore. He feels tired. He'd rather be in Artur's place. Artur is probably not complaining at all, but is enjoying praise and new commissions, but someone has to stay behind to see how things develop now. Looking after you is his rather onerous obligation. He doesn't feel a trace of love for you. He told me so openly. As Clam's former lover, you seem to him, Natur, ally, someone to be respected, and settling into your room and feel like a little Clam for once must be very nice. But that's all. You yourself mean nothing to him. It is only as a small part of his main task that he has had you taken back here. He stayed himself so as not to make you uneasy, but only for the time being, until he gets more news from the castle and you have cured him of his chill. How you slander him, said Frida, and struck her little fists together. Slander him, said Kay. No, I don't mean to slander him, but I may be doing him wrong. That's always possible. What I have said about him isn't clear for all to see. It may be interpreted otherwise. But slander? The only purpose of slander could be to counter your love for him. If that were necessary, and if slander were a suitable means, I wouldn't hesitate to slander him. No one could blame me for that. The man who sent him gave him such an advantage over me that, alone and relying only on myself, I might well try a little slander. It would be a relatively innocent, if ultimately useless, means of defense. So give those fists of yours a rest. And Kate took Frida's hand in his. Frida tried to withdraw it, but smilingly, and not exerting very much strength. However, I don't have to slander him, said Kay. Because you don't love him, you only think you do, and you will be grateful to me for opening your eyes to the deception. Look, if someone wanted to separate you from me without force, but by dint of very careful calculation, then it had to be done through the two assistants. Apparently good, childish, amusing, irresponsible lads coming here from on high, from the castle, a little memory of your childhood too. That's all very delightful, particularly if I am the opposite of all this, always out and about on business that you don't entirely understand, that bothers you, that brings me together with people whom you dislike. And for all my innocence, perhaps you transfer some of that dislike to me. The whole thing is just a malicious, if very clever, exploitation of the flaws in our relationship. Every relationship has its flaws, and so does ours. We came together out of two entirely different worlds, and since we have known each other both our lives, have taken an entirely new turn. We still feel uncertain of ourselves. It is all too new. I am not speaking about myself, that's not so important, and basically I have been given gift after gift since you first turned your eyes to mine, and it's not very difficult to get accustomed to gifts. But you, apart from everything else, were torn away from clam. I can't judge what that means, but I have gradually gained some notion of it. The ground shakes beneath your feet, you can't find your way, and even if I was always ready to steady you, I wasn't always present, and when I was, your attention was sometimes claimed by your reveries or a more physical presence such as the landlady. There were moments when you looked away from me, longing to be somewhere else, somewhere half unspecified, poor child, and in such interim periods suitable people had only to be brought in front of your eyes and you were lost to them, a prey to the pretense that what were only brief moments, ghosts, old memories of your past life now, passing further and further away, still made up your real life in the present. A mistake, Frida, nothing but the last obstacle in the way of our final union, and seen in the right light, it's a pathetic one. Come to yourself, come to your senses. You may have thought that the assistants were sent by Clam, which is not true. They come from Gallater, and if they could cast such a spell on you with the help of that deception, you may then have thought you saw traces of Clam even in their dirt and dissolute ways, just as someone may think he sees a lost jewel in a muck heap, while he couldn't find it there even if it were real. But they are only rough fellows like the servants who sleep in the stables, except that they don't have the same sturdy good health. Little fresh air makes them sick and sends them to bed, although they know how to choose the bed as astutely as any of those servants. Frida had laid her head on Kaya's shoulder, and they walked up and down in silence with their arms around one another. If only, said Frida slowly, calmly, almost contentedly, as if she knew that only a little time of peace against Kaya's shoulder was granted her. But she wanted to enjoy it to the last. If only we had gone away at once. That very night we could be somewhere safe now, still together, your hand always close enough for me to take it. How I need to have you close. How lost I have felt when I am without you ever since we met. Being close to you, believe me, is my dream, that and only that. Then someone called out in the side corridor. It was Jeremias. He stood there on the bottom step in nothing but his shirt, but with a shawl of Frida's wrapped around him. As he stood there, hair to sled, his thin beard looking drenched as if with rain, keeping his eyes open with difficulty, pleading and reproachful, his dark cheeks red, deemed but the flesh of them sagging, his bare legs trembling with cold so that the long fringe of the shawl trembled too. He looked like a patient escaped from the hospital, and setting eyes on him you could think of nothing but getting him back to bed. That was how Frida herself saw it. She moved away from Kay and was beside him. In a minute, having her near him, the careful way with which she drew the shawl more closely around him, her haste in trying to make him go straight back into the room seemed to make Jeremias a little stronger already. It was as if only now did he recognize Kay. "Ah, the land surveyor," he said, while Frida, who didn't want any more talk, patted his cheek soothingly. "Forgive me for disturbing you, but I don't feel at all well, so you'll excuse me. I think I'm running a temperature. I need an infusion to make me sweat. Those damned railings in the school garden, I still think of them, and now, with a chill already, I've been running around all night. A man sacrifices his health without even noticing at once for things that really aren't worth it. But as for you, Mr. Land Surveyor, please don't let me disturb you. Come into our room with us. Come and visit the sick. And tell Frida what else you have to say to her in there. If two people who are well known to each other part, of course they have so much to say in those last moments that a third person even if he is lying in bed waiting for the promised infusion, can't possibly understand it. But do come in, and I'll keep perfectly quiet. Hush, hush, said Frida, pulling at his arm. He's feverish and doesn't know what he's saying. But please don't go with him, Kay. It is my and Jeremiah's room, or rather just my room, and I am forbidding you to go into it. You are persecuting me. Okay. Why are you persecuting me? I will never come back to you. I shudder at the mere thought of it. Go to those girls of yours. They sit on the bench with you beside their stove in nothing but their shifts, as I've been told, and if someone comes looking for you, they spit and hiss at him. I'm sure you feel very much at home there if you are so drawn to the place. I have always tried to keep you away from it with little success, but I did try to keep you from it. Well, that's over now. You are free. You have a fine life before you. You may have to fight the servants a little over one of them, but as for the second girl, no one on earth will grudge her to you. Your union is already blessed. Say nothing against it. I'm sure you'll try to refute it all, but in the end it's not to be denied. Just think, Jeremias, he denied it all. And they nodded and smiled at each other. But Frida went on, supposing he had refuted it all, what good would that have done? What do I care? As for what may happen to someone visiting those folk, that's their business and his, not mine. It is my business to nurse you until you're as healthy as you were before Kay started tormenting you on my account. So you really won't come with us, Mr. Land Surveyor? Asked Jeremias, but Frida, who wouldn't even turn to look at Kay anymore, led him away. Down below, Kay could see a small door even lower than the doors here in the corridor. Not only Jeremias but Frida too had to bend her head. As she went in, it looked bright and warm inside. There was still a little whispering to be heard, probably Frida lovingly persuading Jeremias to go back to bed, and then the door was closed. Chapter 23. Only now did Kay notice how quiet it had become in the corridor, not just in this part of the corridor where he had been standing with Frida and which seemed to be part of the domestic staff's quarters, but also in the long corridor with the rooms that had earlier sounded so lively leading off it. So the gentleman had finally gone to sleep. Kay himself was very tired, perhaps so weary that he hadn't defended himself against Jeremias as he should have done. It might have been cleverer to take his cue from Jeremias himself, who was obviously exaggerating his chill. His pitiful state was not the result of a chill, but was innate in him, not to be cured by any healthy herbal infusion. Yes, to take his cue from Jeremias, make a great spectacle of his very real weariness, collapse here in the corridor, which would surely feel good, sleep for a while, and then perhaps enjoy a little nursing. Only it wouldn't have turned out as well as it did for Jeremias, who would certainly and probably rightly have won in any such competition for sympathy, and no doubt any other contest too. Kay was so tired that he wondered whether he might not try getting into one of these rooms, many of which must be empty, and have a good long sleep in a fine bed. He thought that might compensate for a good deal. He had a nightcap ready to hand too. There had been a small carafe of rum on the tray of china that Frida had left lying on the floor. Kay did not shrink from the effort of going back to it, and emptied the little flask. Now at least he felt strong enough to appear before Erlanger. He looked for the door of Erlanger's room, but as the servant and Gerstacker were no longer to be seen, and all the doors looked the same, he couldn't find it. However, he thought he remembered roughly whereabouts in the corridor the door was, and decided to try opening a door that, in his opinion, was probably the one he wanted. The vent tour couldn't be too risky. If the door led to Erlanger's room, he supposed Erlanger would see him now. If it was someone else's room, he could apologize and leave again, and if the guest in the room was asleep, which was the most likely outcome, Kay's visit wouldn't even be noticed. It could be unfortunate only if the room was empty, for then Kay would hardly be able to resist the temptation of lying down on the bed and getting some sleep at last. He looked to right and left, down the corridor again to see whether, after all, anyone was coming, who could give him information and make his daring venture on Cesare. But the long corridor was quiet and empty. Then Kay listened at the door, but again there was no noise. He knocked so softly that the sound could not have woken anyone sleeping inside. And when still nothing happened, he very cautiously opened the door. However, a slight scream came to his ears. It was a small room more than half filled by a broad bed. The electric light on the bedside table was on, and there was a small traveling bag beside it. In the bed, but entirely hidden under the covers, someone moved uneasily and whispered through a gap between the blanket and the sheet. "Who's there?" Kay couldn't simply leave again now, and he looked unhappily at the handsome but occupied bed, then remembered the question and gave his name. This seemed to make a good impression. The man in the bed drew the blanket back from his face a little way, but in alarm, ready to disappear again if anything was wrong out there. But then, making up his mind, he turned the blanket right back and sat upright. He certainly wasn't Erlanger. He was a small gentleman, evidently in good health, whose features didn't quite fit with each other by virtue of the fact that the cheeks were childishly plump and the eyes childishly merry, but the high forehead, the sharp nose, the narrow mouth with lips that would hardly stay closed, and the almost receding chin were not childish at all, but indicated a capacity for deep thought. It was probably his self-satisfaction with that which had helped him to preserve a pronounced streak of healthy childishness. "Do you know Friedrich?" he asked. Kay said he did not. "But he knows you," said the gentleman, smiling. Kay nodded. There were plenty of people who knew him. In fact, it was one of the chief OBS tackless in his path. "I'm his secretary," said the gentleman, "and my name is Virgil." "I'm sorry," said Kay, reaching for the door handle. "I'm afraid I mixed your door up with another one. I was summoned to see Mr. Secretary Erlanger." "What a pity," said Virgil. "Not that. You're summoned to see someone else. It's a pity you mixed the doors. You see, once I'm woken, I can never get to sleep again." "Well, no need for that to upset you. It's my personal misfortune. Why can't the doors here be locked, do you think?" "There's certainly a reason for. An old saying has it that the doors of secretaries are always open. Still, it needn't be taken quite so literally," and Virgil looked at Kay inquiringly and cheerfully, for despite his complaint he seemed to be well rested, and probably had never been as tired as Kay was just now. "Where are you going?" asked Virgil. "It's 4 in the morning. You'd have to wake up anyone you wanted to see now. Not everyone's as used to being disturbed as I am. Not everyone will take it so patiently. The secretaries are a highly strung lot. So stay here for a while. They begin to get up about 5 o'clock in this place, and then you'll be able to comply with your summons better. So please let go of that handle and sit down somewhere. Not that there's much room, to be sure. You'd better sit on the edge of this bed. Are you surprised that I have neither a chair nor a table in here? Well, I had the choice of either a completely furnished room with a narrow hotel bed, or this big bed and nothing else but the washstand. I chose the big bed. After all, the bed is what matters most in a bedroom. This bed would be really excellent for a good sleeper, a man who could stretch out and sleep well. But it does even me good, always tired as I am, without being able to sleep. I spend a large part of the day in it. I do all my correspondence here, and it's where I conduct my hearings with members of the public. It works very well. To be sure, the members of the public have nowhere to sit, but they can manage without, and anyway it's nicer for them to stand while the person conducting the hearing feels good than to sit comfortably while he keeps shouting at them. So I can offer only this place on the edge of the bed, but it's not an official place, it's just meant for nocturnal conversations. "But you are so quiet, Mr. Land Surveyor." "I'm very tired," said Kay, who had sat down on the bed at once on being invited abruptly and unceremoniously, leaning against the bedpost. "Of course you are," said Virgil, laughing. "Everyone here is tired. For instance, it was no small workload I dealt with both yesterday and today. It's out of the question for me to sleep now, but if that extremely improbable event should occur, if I were to fall asleep while you're here, then please keep perfectly still and don't open the door. Never fear, though, I certainly won't fall asleep, or if I do it will be at most only for a few minutes. The fact is that, probably because I am so used to the coming and going of members of the public, I always sleep most easily when I have company. Do by all means go to sleep, Mr. Secretary," said Kay, pleased to hear this announcement. "And then, if you will allow me, I will get a little sleep too." No, laughed Virgil again. "I'm afraid I can't fall asleep merely on invitation. The opportunity may come only in the course of conversation. Yes, a conversation is the most likely thing to send me to sleep. Our business is bad for the nerves, you see. I, for instance, am a communications secretary. You don't know what that is? Well, I am the main line of communication." And so saying, he rubbed his hands quickly with instinctive cheerfulness between Friedrich and the village. "I deal with communications between his castle seeker, Terry, and his village secretary. I am generally in the village, but not all the time. I have to be ready to drive up to the castle at a moment's notice. You see that traveling bag? It's a restless life. It's not for everyone. On the other hand, it's a fact that I couldn't do without this kind of work now. Any other work would seem to me dull. And what is land surveying like? I'm not doing any of that. I'm not employed as a land surveyor here," said Kay, whose thoughts were not really on the subject. In fact, he was simply longing for Virgil to go to sleep, although even that was out of a certain sense of what he owed to himself. In the depths of his mind, he thought he knew that the moment when Virgil might fall asleep was still incalculably far away. "Well, that's amazing," said Virgil, throwing his head back in a lively manner and producing a notepad from under the blanket to write something down on it. "You are a land surveyor and you have no surveying work to do." Kay nodded mechanically. He had raised his left arm to the top of the bedpost and was resting his head on it. He had already tried various ways of making himself comfortable, but this was the most comfortable position of all. Now he could pay a little more attention to what Virgil was saying. "I am prepared." Virgil went on to pursue this question further. "Matters here are certainly not in such a state that any professional skill ought to be left unused, and it must annoy you too. Don't you suffer from it?" "I do indeed suffer from it," said Kay slowly, smiling to himself. For just now he did not suffer from it in the slightest. Moreover, Virgil's offer made little impression on him. It sounded thoroughly amateurish. Knowing nothing of the circumstances of K.S. appointment, of the difficulties put in its way in the village and the castle, of the complications that had already arisen or looked like arising during K.S. stay here, knowing nothing about any of that, even without giving any sign that, as might have been expected of a secretary, he had some faint idea of it all, he was proposing to put the whole thing in order with the help of his little notepad, just like that. But then Virgil said, "You seem to have had several disappointments already," thus showing a certain understanding of human nature again, and ever since Kay entered this room he had told himself from time to time not to underestimate Virgil. However, in his present condition it was difficult to judge anything properly except his own weariness. No, said Virgil, as if replying to some thought in Kay's mind and kindly sparing him the trouble of saying it out loud. "You mustn't let disappointments deter you. A good deal here seems designed for deterrence, and when you're new to the place you feel it's impossible to get past the obstacles. I don't mean to try finding out how things really are. Perhaps the appearance really corresponds to the reality. In my position, I don't stand at the right distance from it to establish that, but note this, opportunities sometimes arise that have hardly anything to do with the situation as a whole. Opportunities when a word, a glance, a sign of trust can achieve more than tedious, life-long efforts. Yes, that's the way of it. Of course, these opportunities do agree with the situation as a whole insofar as they are never exploited. But why are they not exploited? That's what I always wonder. Kay didn't know. He did indeed realize that what Virgil was talking about probably concerned him closely, but just now he had a great dislike for everything that concerned him closely. He moved his head a little way aside, as if he could thus leave the way clear for Virgil's questions to pass him by and not touch him anymore. It is, Virgil went on, stretching his arms and yawning in confusing contrast to the gravity of his words, it is the secretary's constant complaint that they are obliged to hold most hearings in the village by night. And why do they complain of it? Because it puts too much strain on them? Because they'd rather use the night for sleep? No, they definitely don't complain of that. Of course there are both industrious and less industrious men among the secretaries, as everywhere, but none of them complains of being under excessive strain, certainly not in public. That is simply not our way. So far as that's concerned, we see no difference between ordinary time and time spent working. We are strangers to such distinctions. So what do the secretaries have against hearings conducted by night? Is it perhaps consideration for the members of the public involved? No, that's not it either. The secretaries are not at all considerate of those members of the public, although they are no more inconsiderate of the members of the public than they are of themselves. They are equally inconsiderate to both. And in fact, this inconsiderate attitude, that is to say, the iron observance and performance of their duty, shows the greatest consideration that members of the public could wish for. Fundamentally, although a casual observer will not of course notice it, that is fully appreciated, and as in this case NAL hearings are particularly welcome to members of the public. There is no objection to nocturnal hearings in principle. So why don't the secretaries like them? Kay did not know the answer to that either. He knew so little about the subject that he couldn't even tell whether Virgil was asking a question seriously or only rhetorically. If you'd let me lie down in your bed, he thought, I'll answer any questions you like at midday tomorrow, or even better in the evening. But Virgil did not seem to be taking any notice of Kay. He was too interested in the question that he himself had just raised. As far as I know, and from my own experience, the reservations entertained by the secretaries about nocturnal hearings are more or less as follows. Night is less suitable for negotiation with members of the public because it is difficult or actually impossible to maintain the official character of negotiations at night. That is not because of our war details. Of course, the formalities can be as strictly observed by night as by day, just as one likes. So that's not it, but on the other hand, official judgment suffers by night. One is instinctively inclined to judge things from a more private point of view than the points advanced by members of the public seem to carry more weight than they should. Consideration of the further situation of those members of the public, of their sufferings and sorrows, mingles with our assessment where it does not belong. The requisite barrier between members of the public and officials, however flawlessly it may be present to outward appearance, is relaxed, and where usually only questions and answers are exchanged, which is just as it should be, a strange and entirely unsuitable exchange between the persons sometimes seems to occur. So at least the secretaries say, and they are people whose profession means that they have the gift of an extraordinarily sensitive feeling for such things. But even they, and this is often discussed in our circles, even they notice little of those unfortunate influences during nocturnal hearings. On the contrary, they make great efforts from the first to counter them, and in the end they consider that they have done particularly good work. However, if you read the records later, you are often amazed by the weaknesses so clearly exposed. And it is these errors made to the only partly justified advantage of the members of the public, which cannot be dealt with summarily in the usual way, at least not according to our regulations. Of course, they may be corrected by a supervisory office, but that will be useful only to the law and cannot affect the person concerned for the worse. Wouldn't you say that in such circumstances the complaints of the secretaries are highly justifiable? K had already spent some time half asleep, and now his slumbers were disturbed again. Why all this, he asked himself, why all this? From beneath his lowered eyelids, he observed Virgil not as an official who was discussing difficult questions with him, but simply as something that kept him from sleeping, and he couldn't see any other point to him. Virgil, however, given over entirely to his own train of thought, smiled as if he had just succeeded in leading Kay slightly astray. However, he was ready to set him right again. Nor, he said, can one call those complaints entirely justified either, just like that. Nocturnal hearings are not exactly stipulated anywhere, so no one is breaking any regulation in trying to avoid them, but the circumstances, the excessive amount of work, the way in which the officials in the castle work, the difficulty of getting hold of them, the regulation saying that hearings of members of the public may be held only after the rest of an investigation has been entirely concluded, but must then be held at once. All this and more has made the nocturnal hearings an unavoidable necessity. However, if they have become a necessity, as I say, then that is also, or at least indirectly, as a result of the regular tie-ins, and finding fault with the nature of nocturnal hearings would then be almost, mind you, I am exaggerating slightly so that as it is an exaggeration I may voice it, would then be almost to find fault with the regulations. On the other hand, it may be allowed that the secretaries seek to secure themselves as best they can within the regulations against the nocturnal hearings and their disadvantages, although those may be only apparent, and to a very great extent they do secure themselves. They admit only subjects of negotiation which allow as little as possible to be feared in that respect. They test themselves closely before the negotiations, and if the result of the testing demands it even at the last minute, they withdraw any agreement. They reinforce their authority by frequently summoning a member of the public 10 times before really considering his case. They like to be represented by colleagues who are unqualified to deal with the case concerned and can thus handle it more easily. They at least hold the negotiations at the beginning or end of the night and avoid the mid-day hours. There are plenty of such measures. They do not let any one get the better of them easily. Those secretaries, they are almost as tough as they are sensitive. Kay was asleep. It was not real sleep. He could hear what Virgil was saying perhaps better than during his early period of wakeful exhaustion. Word after word came to his ear, but his troublesome consciousness was gone. He felt free. Virgil no longer had a hold on him. He just sometimes made his way towards Virgil. He was not yet deeply immersed in slumber, but he had taken the plunge, and no one was going to rob him of that now. He felt as if he had won a great victory, as if a company had gathered to celebrate it, and he or someone else was raising a glass of champagne in honor of that victory, and so that everyone would know what it was about. The struggle and the victory were repeated all over again, or perhaps not repeated, perhaps they were only now taking place but had been celebrated earlier, and because luckily the outcome was certain, there was constant celebration. Kay was fighting a naked seeker, Terry, who greatly resembled the statue of a Greek god, and who was getting the worst of it. It was very comical, and Kay smiled slightly in his sleep to see the secretary's proud bearing upset again and again by Kay's advance, so that he had, for instance, to use his outstretched arm and clenched fist to cover his nakedness, but was always too slow about it. The combat did not last long. Step after step, and they were long strides, Kay pressed forward. Was it a combat at all? There was no serious obstacle, only a squeal from the secretary now and then. That Greek god squealed like a girl being tickled. And finally he was gone. K was alone in a large space. He turned around in it, ready to fight, looking for his opponent. But there was no one there anymore. The company had left. Only the champagne glass lay on the ground, broken, and K trod it to pieces. But the broken glass stung, and he woke again with a start, feeling unwell like a small child who has been woken suddenly. All the same, at the sight of Virgil's bared chest, an idea came to him from his dream. Here's your Greek god. Get him out of bed. However, said Virgil, raising his face thoughtfully to the ceiling as if seeking in his memory for examples but failing to find any. All the same, in spite of all the precautionary measures, there is an opportunity for members of the public to exploit this nocturnal weakness of the secretaries, always supposing that it is a weakness for their own ends. To be sure, it is a very rare opportunity, or more accurately, I should say one that almost never comes. Consists in the arrival of the person concerned in the middle of the night. Unanimous, noun said. You may be surprised that this happens so seldom when it seems such an obvious thing to do. Well, you are not familiar with the way we go about things here, but you will have noticed the impenetrability of the official organization. However, that impenetrability in itself means that everyone who has any kind of request to make or must be examined on some subject for other reasons receives a summons at once, immediately, usually even before he has thought out his case, why, even before he knows about it. He will not be examined this time. Usually he won't be examined yet, generally. The case has not reached that point, but he has the summons, which means that he can't turn up unannounced and thus entirely by surprise. At most, he can come at the wrong time when the date and hour of his summons will be pointed out to him, and then, if he comes back at the right time, as a rule he will be sent away, and there is no more difficulty. The summons in the member of the public's hand and the note in the files are weapons used by the secretaries, and if not always quite adequate, they are still strong. That applies, however, only to the secretary responsible for the case. Anyone would still be at liberty to take the other secretaries by surprise at night, but hardly anyone ever will. There's almost no point in it. First, anyone who did so would arouse the ire of the secretary responsible for the case. The secretaries may certainly not be jealous of each other where our work is concerned. Each has only too great a workload to carry. We get more than enough of that, but in dealing with members of the public, we cannot tolerate any interference with our responsibility. Many have lost a case because when they thought they weren't getting anywhere with the secretary responsible, they tried to slip past the network in the wrong way. Such attempts are in fact bound to fail, because a secretary who is not responsible for a case, even if he is taken by surprise at night and feels inclined to help, can hardly intervene in it because he is not responsible any more than any random attorney can, indeed much less so, for even if he might otherwise do something or other, since he knows the secret ways of the law far better than all those legal gentlemen, he simply doesn't have any time for matters for which he is not responsible. He can't spare a minute for them. So who, with these prospects in view, would spend his nights on the trail of secretaries not responsible for his case? And the members of the public are fully occupied in trying to comply with the summonses from and signals given by those who are responsible for their cases, as well as pursuing their usual professions. I mean, fully occupied, of course, as members of the public would understand it, which of course is far from being the same as fully occupied in the sense in which the secretaries would do so. Kay nodded with a smile. He thought he understood all about it, not because it troubled him, but because he was now convinced that he would fall properly asleep in the next few minutes, and this time without any dream or other disturbance. Between the secretaries responsible on one side and those not responsible on the other, and in view of the whole crowd of fully occupied members of the public, he would fall into a deep sleep and thus escape it all. By now he was so used to Virgil's quiet self-satisfied voice, as he obviously endeavored in vain to fall asleep, himself that it was more likely to send him to sleep than disturb his slumbers. Clatter, millwheel, clatter, he thought, clatter on for me. So where, said Virgil, 2 fingers toying with his lower lip, his eyes wide, craning his neck, as if he were approaching a delightful viewing point after an arduous walk. So where is that elusive opportunity I mentioned, the one that almost never comes? The secret lies in the way responsibility is regulated. For it is not possible, nor in a large and living organization can it be, for only a certain secretary to be responsible for every case. It is simply that one secretary has the main responsibility, but many others have responsibility, even if less responsibility for certain parts of it, who, however hard a worker, could accommodate all the papers relating to even the smallest indent on his desk. Even what I have said about the main responsibility is going too far. Is not the whole thing also contained in the smallest responsibility? Is not the ardor with which one approaches the case a crucial point? And is not that always the same, always present at full strength? There may be differences between the secretaries in everything, and there are countless such differences, but not in the matter of ardor. None of them will be able to hold back if he receives an invitation to take part in a case for which he has only the slightest responsibility. Outwardly, however, an ordered opportunity for negotiation must be created, and so a certain secretary comes to the for where the members of the public are concerned, and it is to him that they must officially turn. However, he does not have to be the one who bears the greatest responsibility for the case. The organize, tie-in, and its particular needs at the time influence the decision here. Such is the state of affairs. And now, Mr. Land Surveyor, judge what chance there is for a member of the public through circumstances of some kind, and despite the obstacles already described to you, which in general are perfectly adequate, to take a secretary with a certain responsibility for the case by surprise in the middle of the night after. Well, I suppose you haven't thought of such a thing yet? I'm happy to believe you, but it isn't necessary to think of it because it almost never happens. What a strange little grain of matter, formed in a certain special way. How very small and clever such a member of the public must be if it's to slip through such a perfect sieve. You think, can't happen? You are right, it can't. But then, and who can anti-everything? One night it does happen. To be sure, I know of no one among my acquaintances to whom it has happened, but that doesn't prove much by comparison with the numbers involved. Here, my own acquaintance is limited, and anyway it isn't certain that a secretary to whom such a thing has happened will admit it. It is always a very personal matter, and to some extent carries the stigma of official shame. However, my experience may prove that it is such a rare event, really known only by rumor and with nothing else to confirm it, that it would be going much too far to fear it. Even if it ever really happened, you can, or so I should think, render it entirely harmless by proving, which is easily done, that there is no place for it in this world. Anyway, it is morbid to hide under the bedclothes for fear of such a thing never venturing to look out. And even if that total improbability were suddenly to assume real form, is all lost? Far from it. The fact that all is lost is even more improbable than that most improbable of events. To be sure, if the member of the public is in the room, that is very bad. It inhibits you. How long will you be able to resist? You ask yourself. But you know there will be no resistance. You just have to picture the situation in the right way. There sits the member of the public, whom you have never seen before, whom you have always awaited, positively thirsting to see him, but whom you have always and reasonably considered inaccessible. His mere silent presence invites you to enter into his poor life, to move around there as if it were your own property, to feel sympathy for its vain demands. This invitation in the silence of the night is captivating. You accept it, and now you have in fact stopped being an official. It is a situation in which it will soon become impossible to refuse a request. Strictly speaking, you are desperate, but even more, strictly speaking, you are very happy. Desperate because the defenselessness with which you sit there waiting for the member of the public's request, knowing that once it is made you must grant it, even if, at least so far as you can see, it positively wrecks the official organization. Well, I suppose it is the worst thing that can happen to you in practice. One reason above all and apart from everything else is that it entails your forcibly claiming a higher rank for yourself at this moment, higher than any you can conceive of. Our Tians do not authorize us to grant requests such as those I am talking about, but what with the nocturnal proximity of the member of the public our official powers seem to grow, we pledge ourselves to do things outside our sphere of responsibility. Indeed, we will even do them in practice. Like a robber in the forest, a member of the public, surprising us by night, forces us to make sacrifices of which we would never otherwise be capable. Well, that's how it is if the member of the public is still there, encouraging us and forcing us to do so and spurring us on, and we set it all in train half unconsciously. But how will it be later, when that's all over, when the member of the public goes away, satisfied and free of care, and we are left alone, defenseless, in the face of our abuse of office? It doesn't bear thinking of. Yet all the same, we are happy. How suicidal happiness can be. We could make an effort to keep the true situation secret from the member of the public. The member of the public himself will hardly notice anything of his own accord. As he sees it, he went into a room which wasn't the one he wanted, probably quite by chance, tired out, disappointed, feeling dull and indifferent from weariness and disillusion. Meant he is sitting there knowing nothing and deep in thoughts. If he is thinking anything of his mistake or his weariness, couldn't we leave it at that? No, we can't. With the loquacity of the happy man, we must explain it all. Without sparing ourselves in the slightest, we must show at length what has happened and why. How extraordinary, highly rare and uniquely great the opportunity is. We must show how the member of the public who, with all the helplessness of which only a member of the public can be capable, has walked by chance into his opportunity. We must show him, Mr. Land Surveyor, how the member of the public can now control everything if he wants to, and need do nothing but somehow or other make his request. There is a document for granting it already prepared, we say, ready to be handed to him. We must go into all that. It is a dark hour for an official. But when you have done that, Mr. Land Surveyor, what's most necessary has been done, and you must possess your soul in patience and wait. Kay heard no more. He was asleep, remote from everything that was going on. His head, which had first been laid on his left arm as it held the bedpost above, had slipped off in his sleep and now hung free, sinking gradually lower, for the prop of his arm above it was no longer enough, and Kay instinctively created a new one by bracing his right hand on the blanket, by chance taking hold of Virgil's foot just under the bedclothes. Virgil looked that way and let him hold the foot, though it was probably tiresome for him. Then there were several heavy knocks on the side wall. Kay woke with a start and looked at the wall. "Isn't the Land Surveyor in there?" asked a voice. "Yes," said Virgil, freeing his foot from Kay and suddenly stretching with a wild and willful movement like a little boy. "Then tell him to hurry up and get himself in here," said the voice, without any consideration for Virgil or for the fact that he might still need Kay. "That's Erlanger," said Virgil in a whisper. He did not seem at all surprised to know that Erlanger was in the next room. "Go straight in to him. He's in a temper, so you'd better try to mollify him. He sleeps soundly, but our voices were too loud. When you're speaking of certain subjects, you can't really control your voice. Go along, then. You don't seem able to wake up properly. Go on. What more do you want in here?" No, you don't have to apologize for your drowsiness. Why should you? Physical strength is enough only up to a certain point. who can help it if that very point is also very significant otherwise. No one can help it. That's the way the world corrects itself in its course and keeps its balance. It's an excellent, incredibly excellent arrangement, although dismal in other respects. Now do run along. I don't know why you're staring at me like that. If you hesitate any longer, Erlanger will be down on me like a ton of bricks, and that's something I'd much rather avoid. Go on. Who knows what you should expect over there? This place is full of opportunities. Well, of course there are opportunities too great, in a certain way, to be exploited. There are things that fail only of their own volition and for no other reason. Yes, amazing. Anyway, I hope I can get a little sleep now, though it's 5 in the morning already and the noise will soon begin. I do wish to goodness you'd go away. At last. Dazed from being woken suddenly from deep sleep, still in dire need of more sleep. His body hurting all over as a result of his uncomfortable position on the bed, Kay couldn't bring himself to stand up. For some time, he clutched his forehead and looked down at his lap. Even Virgil's repeated goodbyes couldn't get him moving. He was induced to move only by a sense of the total futility of lingering in this room any longer. The room seemed to him indescribably bleak. Whether it had become like that or had always been like that, he couldn't say. He wouldn't even manage to get to sleep again here. That conviction was in fact the deciding factor. Smiling at it slightly, he rose, propping himself against anything he could find to support him, the bed, the wall, the door, and he went out without a word, as if he had taken leave of Virgil long ago. Chapter 24. He would probably have passed Erlanger's door with equal indifference if Erlanger hadn't been standing in the doorway, crooking his forefinger to beckon him in. Erlanger was already fully clothed, preparing to leave. He wore a black fur coat with a high-buttoned collar. A servant was just handing him his gloves, and still held a fur cap. "You were supposed to be here long ago," Erlanger said. Kay was about to apologize, but by closing his eyes wearily Erlanger showed that he could do without that. "It's about the following matter," he said. "There was once a girl called Frida serving in the bar. I know only her name. I don't know the girl herself. I'm not concerned with her. This Frida sometimes brought Clam his beer. There seems to be another girl there now. The change is of no significance, of course. Probably not for anyone and certainly not for Clam. But the more important a man's work, and Clam's is certainly the most important, and of all, the less strength he has left to defend himself against the outside world, and as a consequence any insignificant change in the most insignificant little things can be seriously disturbing to him. The smallest change on his desk, the removal of a dirty mark that has been there forever, anything like that can upset a man, and so can the arrival of a new barmaid. Well, of course nothing of the kind bothers Clam. There can be no question of that, even if it would bother anyone else in any line of work you like to mention. All the same, we are in duty bound to watch over Clam's comfort by removing troublesome factors if they appear to us potentially upsetting, even if they do not, as is very probable, upset him at all. We remove these troublesome factors not for his sake, not for his work's sake, but for our own sake, for the sake of our conscience and peace of mind. So that girl Frida must return to the bar at once. Perhaps her return will itself be disturbing. Then and only then will we send her away again, but for the time being, however, she must come back. I'm told that you are living with her, so kindly make sure she comes back immediately. Personal feelings must be left out of this, that's obvious, so I am not going to enter into any further discussion of it. I am already doing more than is really necessary if I say that, should you be of service in this small matter, it could possibly be useful to you in your further progress. And that is all I have to say to you. He nodded to Kay in farewell, put on the fur cap handed to him by his servant, and went down the corridor, walking fast but with a slight limp, and followed by the servant. Sometimes the orders given here were very easy to carry out, but Kay didn't like the ease of this one at all. That was not just because this order concerned Frida and, indeed, while it was intended as an order, it sounded to Kay like ridicule, but above all because it showed Kay how useless all his own efforts were. Orders were given above his head, the unfavorable and the favorable alike, and ultimately even the favorable probably had a nub of something unfavorable in them, but anyway they all went above his head, and his status was far too low for him to intervene or actually silence them and get his own voice heard. If Erlanger waves you away, what will you do? And if he were not to wave you away, what could you say to him? Kay was in fact clear in his own mind that his weariness had harmed him more today than anything unfavorable in the circumstances, but why could he, who had believed he could rely on his physical strength and would never have set out without that conviction, why could he not endure a few disturbed nights and one without any sleep at all? Why was he so uncontrollably tired here, in this particular place, where no one was ever tired, or perhaps more likely people were always tired without its affecting their work, but instead seeming to be good for it? You could conclude from that fact that, in its own way, it was a weariness entirely different from KS. Here, it was probably weariness in the midst of enjoyable work, something that from outside looked like weariness, but was really unshakable calm, unshakable peace. If you are a little tired at noon, that's part of the natural and happy course of the day. And for the gentleman here, Kay told himself, it's always noon. Very much in keeping with that idea, signs of life were now heard all over the place on both sides of the corridor at 5 in the morning. At first, the babble of voices in the rooms had something extremely cheerful about it. Sometimes it sounded like the happy shouting of children getting ready for an outing, or then again, like chickens waking up in the henhouse, a joyful noise just right for the dawning day. Somewhere or other, one of the gentlemen was even imitating the crowing of a cockerel. The corridor itself was still empty, but the doors were beginning to move. They kept being opened just a little way and quickly closed again. There was a positive percussion of such opening and closing of doors in the corridor, and, now and then, looking through the gaps where the walls didn't reach the ceiling, Kay saw tousled morning heads appear, only to disappear. Next minute, in the distance, a small trolley laden with files was being slowly pushed along by a servant. A second servant walked beside him with a list in his hand, obviously comparing the numbers on the doors with numbers on the files. The trolley stopped outside most of the doors, and then usually the door was opened and the relevant files handed into the room, or sometimes just a note. In such cases, a little conversation would go on between the room and the corridor, probably a gentleman telling the servant off. If the door stayed closed, its files were carefully piled up just outside it. When that happened, it seemed to Kay as if the movement of the doors around him was no less, although the files had been distributed but even increased. Perhaps the others were looking longingly at the files which were lying outside the door and, for some incomprehensible reason, hadn't been taken in yet. They couldn't understand how someone who had only to open his door to lay hands on his files didn't do so. Perhaps it was even possible that files which remained lying about would be distributed later to the other gentlemen who were already looking out at frequent intervals to see whether the files were still outside the door, meaning that there was still hope for themselves. Furthermore, the files left lying there were usually in particularly large bundles, and Kay assumed that they had been left where they were for now, either out of a certain malicious desire to show off or for motives of well-justified pride intended to encourage the colleagues of the gentleman in the room. He was confirmed in this assumption by the fact that sometimes, always when he didn't have pen to be looking, after the stack of files had been on show long enough, it was suddenly and very quickly snapped up and taken into the room, and the door then remained closed as before. The doors all around calmed down at that point, either disappointed or pleased to see that such a provocative item had finally been removed, but then they slowly began moving again. Kay saw all this with interest as well as curiosity. He felt almost happy, in the midst of this stir and bustle, looking this way and that, following the servants, though keeping a suitable distance behind, and indeed, they had often turned to look at him with a stern glance, lowered heads, and pouting lips, as he observed their work of distribution. The longer it lasted, the less smoothly did it go. Either the list wasn't perfectly accurate, or the servants couldn't always tell one file from another very well, or the gentleman made objections for other sons, but at any rate, it turned out that many of the files already distributed had to be returned, and then the little trolley went back, and negotiations about the return of the files took place through the crack where the door stood ajar. These negotiations themselves were full of problems, but it quite often happened that when something had to be returned, doors that had been in the liveliest movement earlier were now firmly shut, as if they didn't want to know anything about what was going on. Only then did the real problems begin. The gentleman who thought he had a claim to the files would wax extremely impatient, make a great deal of noise in his room, clapping his hands, stamping his feet, and repeatedly calling the number of a certain file out into the passage. Then the trolley was often left abandoned. One of the servants would be busy mollifying the impatient gentleman, while the other stood outside a closed door fighting for the return of the file. Both servants had a hard time of it. Attempts to placate the impatient gentleman often made him even more impatient. He wouldn't listen to the servant's empty words any longer. He didn't want consolation, he wanted files. One such gentleman poured a whole bowlful of water over the servant through the gap at the top of his door. But the other servant, obviously higher ranking, had an even worse time. If the gentleman concerned would enter into negotiations at all, discussions of the facts ensued, in which the servant cited his list while the gentleman cited his notes and the actual files that he was supposed to return, but was now clutching so firmly that hardly a corner of them was still visible to the servant's avid eyes. Then the servant had to go back to the trolley for more evidence. By now it had run on of its own accord down the slight slope of the COR rider, or he had to go after the gentleman who was claiming the files, and exchange the protests of the gentleman currently in possession of them for a new set of counter-protests. Such negotiations went on for a very long time, and sometimes it was agreed that the gentleman would give back a part of the files or would be given a different file in compensation, since they had only been mixed up. But it sometimes happened that a gentleman had to give up all the files demanded at once, whether because the evidence produced by the servant had driven him into a corner, or because he was tired of the constant bargaining. Then he didn't hand them to the servant, but instead, with a sudden decisive gesture, threw them a long way down the COR rider so that the string tying them together came off. Sheets of paper flew around, and the servants had great trouble putting everything back in order. However, all this was relatively simpler than when the servant got no answer at all when he went to ask for the files back. Then he stood outside the closed door, begging and pleading, citing his list, calling on the regulations, all in vain, for not a sound came from inside the room, and obviously the servant had no right to enter it without permission. Then even this model servant sometimes lost his self-control and went to his little trolley, sat down on the files, wiped the sweat from his brow, and did nothing at all for a while but dangle his feet helplessly in the air. All around him great interest was shown in that there was much whispering, scarcely a door remained still, and up along the tops of the walls faces, curiously enough almost entirely wrapped in scarves, followed all that was going on, but never stayed where they were for long. In the midst of all this turmoil, Kay noticed that Virgil's door had remained closed the whole time, and the servants had passed down that part of the corridor already, but no files had been handed out to Virgil. Perhaps he was still asleep, and what with all the racket that would have meant. His sleep was sound and very healthy, but why had he not been given any files? Only a very few rooms had been passed over in that way, and they were probably empty. On the other hand, there was already a new and particularly restless guest in what had been Erlanger's room. Erlanger must have been positively driven out by him in the night, which would not have suited Erlanger's own cool and down-to-earth nature, but the fact that he had been obliged to wait for Kay in the doorway of the room suggested that such was the case. Kate kept coming back from all these other observations to the servant. What he had been told about the servants in general, their laziness, the comfortable life they led, their arrogance, certainly didn't apply to this one. There must be exceptions among the servants. Two or more probably there were different groups of servants, for here, as Kay noticed, there were demarcations of which he had previously seen hardly any hint. In particular, he admired the unyielding determination of this servant. The servant was not giving up in his battle with these obstinate little rooms. To Kay, it often seemed a battle with the rooms themselves, since he hardly saw anything of their occupants. He felt tired, to be sure, who wouldn't have felt tired? But he would soon pull himself together, slip down from the trolley, and make for the door that must be conquered, walking very erect and clenching his jaws grimly, and it could happen that he was beaten back 2 or 3 times by very simple means, simply by the dreadful silence inside the room, and yet was not overcome. When he saw that open attack was no good, he tried something different. For instance, so far as Kay could make out, he tried cunning. He would appear to go away from the door, letting it exhaust its powers of silence, so to speak, and turn to other doors, but after a while he would come back, call in a loud and very audible voice to the other servant, and begin piling files outside the closed door as if he had changed his mind, and there was nothing to be rightfully taken away from the gentleman. Instead, he was to get more files. Then he went on, but kept his eye on the door, and if the gentleman inside, as usually happened, soon cautiously opened the door to take in the new files, the servant was there in a flash, wedged his foot in the doorway, and obliged the gentleman at least to negotiate with him face to face, which usually brought the argument to a conclusion that was at least partly satisfactory. And if that didn't work, or it didn't appear to him the best way to approach a certain door, he would try yet another trick. He moved on, for instance, to the gentleman claiming the files. Then he would push aside the other servant, who was still mechanically distributing files and was not much of a help to him, and begin persuading the gentleman himself, whispering in conspiratorial tones with his head well inside the room, probably making promises and giving assurances that next time files were distributed the other gentleman would meet with proper retribution. At least he pointed frequently at the door of the first gentleman's opponent, laughing as far as his weariness would allow. But then there were cases, 1 or 2 of them, where he simply gave up any attempt, although even here Kate thought he was only appearing to give up, or at least giving up on reasonable grounds, for he went calmly on, putting up with the noise made by a gentleman who felt badly treated, and only the way he sometimes closed his eyes for quite a while showed that he suffered from the racket. But the gentleman would gradually calm down, and his protests were made less often, just as the uninterrupted crying of children gradually turns to isolated sobs. But even after he had fallen silent, there was still an occasional screech from his room, or its door was swiftly opened and slammed again. At least it turned out that here, the servant had probably done just the right thing. In the end, there was only one gentleman left who would not calm down. He remained silent for a long time, but only to get his breath back, and then he started up again, making just as much fuss as before. It was not quite clear why he was shouting and complaining like that. Perhaps it wasn't to do with the distribution of the files at all. By now the servant had finished his work, and there was only a single file, or really just a piece of paper torn from a notepad, left on the trolley. That was the other servant's fault. An idea went through Kay's head. Why, he thought, that could very well be my file. The village mayor had called his a very minor case. and K. However random and ridiculous his assumption seemed even to himself, tried to approach the servant, who was looking thoughtfully at the sheet of paper. However, that wasn't easy, for the servant did not react well to the interest that K. was taking in him. Even in the middle of his hardest work, he had always found time to look round at K with an angry or impatient and nervous jerk of his head. Only now that the files were distributed did he seemed to have forgotten K for the moment and seemed indifferent, which his exhaustion made understandable. He wasn't taking much trouble with the sheet of paper either, perhaps he wasn't even reading it, just looking as if he was, and although he would probably have made any of the gentlemen in the rooms happy by giving them this sheet of paper, he decided not to. He was tired of distributing files. With his forefinger to his lips, he signed to his companion to keep quiet, and then K was nowhere near him yet, tore up the sheet of paper into small pieces and put it in his pocket. This was the first irregularity that K had seen in all the office business here, although it was possible that he had misunderstood it. And even if it had been an irregularity, it could be forgiven, considering the circumstances. The servant could not work flawlessly all the time. A point must come when his accumulated annoyance and uneasiness must break out, and venting it simply by tearing up a small sheet of paper was innocent enough. The voice of the gentleman who wasn't to be mollified was still echoing down the corridor, and his colleagues, who in other respects didn't behave in a very friendly way to each other, seemed to be all of the same opinion about the noise he was making. It was coming to seem as if the gentleman had assumed the task of making enough noise for them all, and their shouts and nods of the head merely encouraged him to go on with it. But now it didn't bother the servant anymore. He had finished his work and, taking hold of the trolley, signed to the other servant to do the same. So they wheeled it away again just as they had come, only more contentedly, and so fast that the trolley jolted along in front of them. Only once did they stop suddenly and look back when the shouting gentleman outside, whose door K was now wandering around, he would have liked to know what the gentleman really wanted, had obviously deciding that screaming was getting him nowhere. He seemed to have found an electric bell push, and in his delight at being relieved in this way began ringing the bell continuously instead of screaming. Thereupon loud murmuring, which seemed to indicate approval, came from the other rooms. The gentleman appeared to be doing something they would all have liked to do for a long time, and had been obliged to leave undone only for some unknown reason. Was it perhaps the servants? Was it perhaps Frida that the gentleman hoped to summon by ringing? He would have to wait a long time. Frida was probably busy wrapping Jeremias in wet towels, and even if he was better by now, she wouldn't have the time to come, for then she would be lying in his arms. But the ringing of the bell did have an immediate effect. The landlord of the Castle Inn himself came hurrying up from a distance, clad in black and neatly buttoned up as usual, but the way he ran suggested that he was forgetting his dignity. His arms were half outstretched as if he had been called to the scene of some great disaster and was prepared to seize the cause of it, clamp it to his chest, and so stifle it, and with every little irregularity in the ringing of the bell he seemed to jump in the air for a moment and then hurry even faster. And now his wife also peered a long way behind him. She too was running with her arms outstretched, but her steps were small and dainty, and Cave thought she would arrive too late. The landlord would have dealt with everything before she got there. Kay pressed close to the wall to give the landlord room to run by, but the landlord stopped right in front of him as if Kay himself were his destination, and next moment the landlady was there too, both of them heaping reproaches on him, which in all the haste and surprise he didn't understand, particularly as the gentleman's bell joined in as well, and other bells began ringing too, not with any sense of emergency now, but just for fun and in an excess of high spirits, since Kay was very anxious to discover exactly what he had done wrong. He was perfectly happy for the landlord to take his arm and frog march him away from all this noise, which was getting louder and louder, for behind them Kate didn't turn to look because the landlord was talking to him and the landlady on his other side was talking even more. Behind them the doors now opened wide. The corridor was teeming with life. There seemed to be coming and going as if it were a narrow but busy alley. The doors ahead of them were obviously waiting impatiently for Kate to come past so that they could let the gentleman inside those rooms out. And through all this the bells rang as the gentleman pushed them again and again as if to celebrate a victory. And now at last they were in the quiet white yard again, where several sleighs were waiting. Did Cave gradually gather what it was all about? Neither the landlord nor the landlady understood how Kay could have done anything of the kind. But what exactly had he done? Kay asked again and again, although he didn't get the chance to ask for long because his guilt was only too obvious to both of them, and they didn't believe for a moment that he was asking in good faith. Only bit by bit did Kay find out what the matter was. He had no right to be in the corridor. In general, he could enter only the bar, and that only as a favor which could be withdrawn. If he had been summoned to see a gentleman, he must of course go to the place to which he had been summoned, but must always remain aware. He did have his wits about him. They imagined, like anyone else, that he was somewhere where he did not belong, to which he had been summoned only by a gentleman, and very unwillingly at that, merely because official business required and justified it. He therefore had to turn up quickly, go through his hearing, and then disappear even more quickly if possible. Hadn't he felt how very wrong it was for him to be there in the corridor? And if he had, then how could he have gone wandering around there like an animal out at pasture? Hadn't he been summoned to a nocturnal hearing, and didn't he know why such hearings were held at night? Such hearings, and here Kay did get a new explanation of the point of them, were held at night with the sole purpose of questioning members of the public, the sight of whom would be entirely intolerable to the gentleman by day, thus getting through the hearing quickly, by night and in artificial light, so that directly it was over the men could forget all that unpleasantness in slumber. Kay's conduct, however, had made a mockery of all these precautionary measures. Even ghosts disappear when morning comes, but Kay had stayed there, with his hands in his pockets, as if expecting that if he did not remove himself, the entire corridor might remove itself instead, rooms and gentlemen and all, and he could be sure, they said, that just that would have happened if it had only been possible, for the gentleman's feelings were extremely sensitive. None of them would drive Kay away or even say, which was obvious, that he ought to go away. None of them would do that, although they were probably trembling with agitation all the time. Kay was there and spoiling the morning for them, their best time of day. Instead of taking any proceedings to get rid of Kay, they preferred to suffer in silence, although no doubt hoping that Kay would finally see what was so strikingly obvious, when he himself would suffer to the point where the pain of it was intolerable and matched the gentleman's own suffering, for it was so very wrong to be standing here in the corridor in the morning, where everyone could see him. But such hopes had been in vain. The gentlemen didn't know, or in their kindness and condescension, wouldn't acknowledge that there might be insensitive, hard hearts, which could not be softened even by proper respect. Doesn't even the night-flying moth, poor creature, seek out a quiet corner when day comes, flatten itself as if it would like to disappear, and suffer, because it can't? But as for Kay, oh no, he stands where he is most conspicuous, and if he could prevent day from dawning like that, then he would. Well, he can't prevent it, but he could, unfortunately, delay it and make it much worse. Hadn't he seen the files being distributed? It was something that no one was allowed to see except those most closely concerned. Something that neither the landlord nor the landlady could witness in their own house. Something of which they had heard tell only in hints like those dropped today by the servant. Hadn't he seen the difficulties attendant on the tie-in of the files, something in itself beyond understanding, since every one of the gentlemen was simply serving the good cause, never thought of his own advantage, and must work with all his powers to ensure that the distribution of the files, that important and fundamental part of the work, was done quickly, easily, and without any errors? And hadn't Cave really had even a distant presentiment that the main point of all the difficulties consisted in the fact that the tie-in of the files must take place with the doors almost closed, with no possibility of direct communication between the gentlemen, who could of course have agreed with one another in an instant, while communication through the servants was bound to drag on almost for hours, could never be done without complaints, which was a constant trial to both the gentlemen and the servants, and one which would probably have adverse consequences for the rest of the work done later. Why couldn't the gentlemen communicate with one another directly? Did Kay still not understand? Such a thing had never before happened to the landlady, she said, and the landlord confirmed it for himself, even though they had been obliged to deal with all kinds of recalcitrant persons. Things that one usually dared not mention must be told to him openly, for otherwise he wouldn't understand the most essential point. Well, since it had to be said, it was on his account, only and exclusively on his account, that the gentlemen had not been able to come out of their rooms, since just after waking up in the morning they were too bashful, too vulnerable, to be exposed to the glance of strange eyes. They feel positively too exposed to show themselves, even if they happen to be fully clothed. It is difficult to say why they feel bashful, perhaps constant workers. As they were just ashamed of having gone to sleep. But perhaps they are even more bashful when it comes to seeing strangers than they feel about being seen themselves, and they do not now want to be suddenly and immediately confronted, first thing in the morning, with the distressing sight of members of the public, large as life and twice as natural, a sight that, fortunately, they have age to overcome with the help of the nocturnal hearings. They are just not equal to it. And what kind of a human being wouldn't respect that? Well, someone like Cabe, someone who would set himself above everything, above the law, above the most ordinary human consideration for others, and do it with dull indifference and lethargy, someone who doesn't mind making the distribution of the files all but impossible, who harms the reputation of therein and is the cause of something never known before. The gentlemen, driven to distraction, begin to defend themselves, and after summoning up what to ordinary people is almost unimaginable willpower, reach for their bells and ring for help in getting rid of K. Since there is no other way of doing it, they, the gentlemen, calling for help, wouldn't the landlord and landlady and all their staff have come long before if they had only dared to appear before the gentlemen in the morning without being summoned, even if it was only to bring help and then go away at once? Quivering with their indignation at K.'s conduct, inconsolable at being so powerless, they had waited here at the beginning of the corridor, and the ringing of the bell that they had never really expected had been such a release for them. Well, the worst was over. If only they could get a glimpse of the happiness of the gentle men now that they were finally delivered from K. It wasn't over yet. For K himself, of course, he would certainly have to answer for what he had done. By now they had reached the bar. Why the landlord, for all his anger, had brought K here was not entirely clear, but perhaps he had realized that K's exhaustion made it impossible for him to leave the house at once. Without waiting to be asked to sit down, K positively collapsed on to one of the casks. It was good to be there in the dark. Only one weak electric light above the beer pools was switched on. It was still dark outside too, and there seemed to be driving snow. He must be thankful to be here in the warm and take care not to be driven out. The landlord and landlady went on standing in front of him as if he still represented imminent danger, as if he were so totally unreliable that they couldn't entirely exclude the possibility of his suddenly setting out to try getting back into the corridor. They were tired themselves after the nocturnal alarms and rising early, especially the landlady, who was wearing a wide-skirted brown dress that fled like silk and was rather carelessly buttoned and done up where had she found it in her haste, and had now laid her head on her husband's shoulder, was dabbing her eyes with a delicate little kerchief, now and then, like a child, casting angry glances at Kay. To mollify the couple, Kay said that everything they had told him was entirely new to him, but that even though he had not been aware of it, he would never have stayed so long in the corridor where he really had no business and certainly no desire to upset anyone, except that he was so exhausted. He thanked them, he said, for putting an end to the painful scene. If he was to be called to account for it, he would welcome that, for only in that way could he prevent his conduct from being generally misunderstood. His weariness was solely to blame, nothing else, but that weariness arose from his not being used to the strain of the hearings. After all, he hadn't been here very long. Once he had some experience of it, nothing of the kind could happen again. Perhaps he took the hearings too seriously, but surely that wasn't a bad thing in itself. He had been through 2 hearings in quick session, one with Virgil and the second with Erlanger, and the first, in particular, had worn him out, although the second hadn't taken long. Erlanger had simply wanted to ask him a favor, but both together had been more than he could stand at once. Perhaps some thing of the kind might be too much for others too, even the landlord. He had staggered away from the second hearing in what was almost a state of intoxication. After all, he had seen and heard the 2 gentlemen for the first time, and had been expected to answer them. As far as he knew, it had all turned out well. But then the misfortune had happened, although he could hardly be held to blame for it after what had gone before. Unfortunately, only Erlanger and Virgil had seen the condition he was in, and he was sure they would have spoken up for him and averted anything unfortunate. But Erlanger had had to leave directly after the hearing, obviously to go to the castle, and Virgil, probably tired after the hearing himself, so how could Kay have survived it unaffected? Had gone to sleep and even slept through the distribution of the files. If a similar report nighty had come Kay's way, he would happily have taken it, thus avoiding all glimpses of anything forbidden, and that would have been all the easier in that he really had been in no state to see anything, so even the most sensitive of the gentlemen could have shown themselves in front of him without fear. The mention of the 2 hearings, particularly the one with Erlanger, and the respect with which Cave spoke of the 2 gentlemen, made the landlord more inclined to tolerate him. He seemed about to agree to Kay's request to let him put a plank on the casks and sleep there at least until daylight came, but the landlady was clearly against it and kept tugging uselessly here and there at her dress, the disorder of which she seemed to have noticed only now, and shaking her head again and again, what was obviously a long-standing argument about the cleanliness of the house seemed about to break out again. To Kay, weary as he was, the conversation between husband and wife took on enormous importance. To be driven away from here seemed a misfortune greater than any he had yet known. It must not happen, even if the landlord and landlady were to unite against him. Slumped on the cask, he watched the 2 of them warily, until the landlady, in her own unusual sensitivity, which Kay had noticed long ago, suddenly stepped aside and cried out. She had probably just been talking to the landlord about something else. "See how he's looking at me. Send him away. Do." But Kay, seizing his opportunity and now feeling sure, almost to the point of indifference, that he would be staying, said, "I'm not looking at you. I'm only looking at your dress." "Why, my dress?" asked the agitated landlady. Kay just shrugged. "Come along," the landlady told the landlord. "He's drunk, the lout. Leave him here to sleep it off." And she told Peppy, who at her call emerged from the darkness looking tired and tousled, with a broom held Leslie in her hand to throw Kay a cushion or so. Chapter 25. When Kay woke up, he thought at first that he had hardly slept at all. The room was just the same, warm and empty. All the walls in darkness, but with that one electric light above the beer pools and night outside the windows. But when he stretched, the cushion fell to the floor and the board and casks creaked. Peppy arrived at once, and now he discovered that it was evening and he had slept for over 12 hours. The landlady had asked after him several times during the day, and Jerstacker, who had been sitting here over a beer in the dark when Kay spoke to the landlady in the morning but hadn't liked to disturb him, had also looked in once to see how he was. Finally, it appeared that Frida too had come in and stood beside Kay for a little while, but she hadn't really come on his account, only because she had several things to get ready here before returning to her old job that evening. "I suppose she doesn't fancy you anymore?" asked Peppy, as she brought coffee and cakes. However, she asked not in her old malicious way, but sadly, as if now she had come to know the malice of the world for herself, and beside it any personal malice pales and loses its point. She spoke to Kay like a companion in misfortune, and when he tasted the coffee and she thought she saw that it wasn't sweet enough for him, she went off and brought him the full sugar bowl. It was true that her melancholy had not kept her from decking herself out today even more extravagantly perhaps than last time Kay had seen her. She wore a profusion of bows and ribbons threaded through her hair, which she had carefully arranged with curly tongs over her forehead and temples. Around her neck she wore a necklace hanging down into the low-cut neck of her blouse. When Kay, feeling glad to have had a long sleep and some good coffee, surreptitiously took hold of one of the bows and tried to undo it, Peppy said wearily, "Leave me alone," and sat down on a cask beside him. Kay didn't have to ask why she was unhappy, for she began telling him at once, her gaze fixed on Kay's coffee pot as if she needed something to distract her mind as she told him about it, as if even when she thought about her suffering it was more than she could do to give herself up to it entirely. First, Kay discovered that he himself was to blame for Peppy's unhappiness, but she didn't bear him a grudge for that, she said, and she nodded eagerly as she told her tale to keep Kay from contradicting anything. First, he had taken Frida away from the bar and thus made it possible for Peppy to rise to the position of barmaid. Peppy could think of nothing else that might have induced Frida to give up her post. She sat there in the bar like a spider in its web, casting her threads far and wide as only she could. It would have been impossible to remove her against her will. Only love for someone of low status, a love that was unfit for her position, could drive her from it. And what about Peppy? Had she ever aspired to such a post for herself? She was a chambermaid. She had an insignificant job with few prospects, like every other girl she dreamed of. A wonderful future you can't forbid anyone to dream, but she didn't seriously expect to get very far. She had come to terms with what she had already attained. And then Frida suddenly left the bar so suddenly that the landlord didn't have a suitable replacement to hand. He looked around and his eye fell on Peppy, who had certainly done her own part here by putting herself forward. At that time she loved Kay as she had never loved anyone before. She had been living for months in her tiny, dark room down below and expected to spend years there, her whole life if the worst came to the worst, with no one paying her any attention. And then along came Kay, all of a sudden a hero, a deliverer of maidens, and he had opened the way for her to rise. Not that he knew anything about her, he hadn't done it for her sake, but that didn't make her any less grateful. On the night when she was appointed barmaid, the appointment wasn't certain yet, but it was very probable. She spent hours talking to him, whispering her thanks into his ear. What he had done seemed even greater to her, because the burden he had taken on his own shoulders was Frida. There was something amazingly unselfish in the fact that to free Peppy From her predicament, he was making Frida his mistress, an unattractive thin girl not as young as she used to be, with short, sparse hair, a sly girl too who always had secrets of some kind, just the thing you might expect from her appearance. Although her face and body were undoubtedly a miserable sight, she must at least have had other secrets that no one could know about, perhaps to do with her alleged relationship with Clam. At the time, Peppy even entertained ideas like this. Was it possible that Cave really loved Frida? Wasn't he deceiving himself, or was he perhaps deceiving no one but Frida? And would the only result of all this be just Peppy's rise in the world? Would Kay see his mistake then, or stop trying to hide it and take notice of Peppy instead of Frida? That wasn't such a wild idea of Peppy's, for as one girl against another she could hold her own against Frida very well. No one would deny that, and it had been primarily Frida's position as barmaid and the luster with which Frida had managed to endow it that had dazzled Kay at the moment when he met her. And then Peppy had dreamed that when she had the position herself, Kay would come to plead with her, and she would have the choice of either listening to Kay and losing the job or turning him down and rising higher. She had worked it out that she would give up everything and lower herself to his level and teach him the true love that he could never know with Frida, the love that is independent of all the grand positions in the world. But then it all turned out differently, and what was to blame for that? Kay first and foremost, and then of course Frida's crafty, sly nature. Kay first, said Peppy, because just what did he want? What strange kind of person was he? What was he after? What important matters occupied his mind to make him forget all that was closest to him, all that was best and most beautiful? Peppy was the victim in all this. Everything was stupid, all was lost. And if there was a man with the strength of mind to set fire to the whole castle in and burn it to the ground, leaving no trace, like a piece of paper in the stove, he would be the man of Peppy's dreams today. Well, so Peppy came to work in the bar, she went on, for days ago just before lunchtime. It's not easy work here, she said. In fact, it's murder, but you could do a lot for yourself. Peppy never used to live in the moment, and although in her wildest dreams she wouldn't have thought of rising to occupy the post of barmaid herself, she kept her eyes open. She knew what the job was like. She hadn't been unprepared when she took it on. You can't take a post on unprepared, or you'd lose it in the first few hours, particularly if you behaved the way the chambermaids here did. When you're a chambermaid, you feel forgotten and forlorn. It's like working down the mine, or at least it is in the corridor where the secretaries stay. You don't see a soul for days on end except for a few members of the public flitting back and forth, never venturing to look up. No one but the 2 or 3 other chambermaids who feel just as bitter about their lot. You can't leave your room in the morning. The secretaries want to be on their own. The servants bring their food from the kitchen. The chambermaids don't usually have anything to do with that, and you can't show yourself in the corridor at mealtimes either. It's only while the gentlemen are working that the chambermaids are allowed to tidy up, not of course in the rooms that are occupied, but in those that happen to be empty, and the housework has to be done very quietly so as not to disturb the gentlemen at their work. But how can anyone clean and tidy quietly if the gentlemen stay in their rooms day after day, and then there are the servants going around, dirty riffraff that they are, and when a room is finally free for the chamber maid to go in, it's in such a state that not even a deluge could wash it clean. It's true that the gentlemen who come here are very fine, but you have a hard time of it mastering your disgust so that you can clean up after them. The chambermaids don't have too much work, but what there is of it is tough going, and never a word of praise, only blame, particularly the frequent and vexatious accusation that files have been lost while you were clearing up. In fact, nothing is ever lost. Every tiny piece of paper is handed in to the landlord. Well, files do get lost, yes, but it's not the maid's fault. And then commissions of inquiry come along, and the maids have to leave their room, and the commission of inquiry takes their beds apart. the maids don't have any possessions. Their few things fit into a pannier you can carry on your back, but the Commission of Inquiry spends hours searching all the same. Of course, it never finds anything. How would files get into the maids' rooms? What would the maids do with files? But once again, the result is angry scolding and threats on the part of the disappointed Commission of Inquiry, conveyed only through the landlord. And never any peace, not by day or by night. Noise half the night, noise from first thing in the morning. If only the chambermaids at least didn't have to live there. But they must, because it's their boozy nest to bring small things ordered from the kitchen in between times, particularly at night. Again and again you hear that sudden banging of a fist on the chambermaid's door. The order is dictated, you run down to the kitchen, you shake the sleeping kitchen boys awake, you leave the tray of whatever has been ordered outside the chambermaid's door, from which the gentlemen's servants fetch it. How dreary it all is. But that's not the worst. The worst is when there are no orders and, in the middle of the night when everyone ought to be asleep and most people really do get to sleep in the end, you sometimes hear someone slinking around outside the chambermaid's door. Then the maids get out of bed, the beds are above each other, there's very little space anywhere there. The whole room where the maids sleep is really no more than a big cupboard with 3 compartments. They listen at the door, they kneel down, they clutch one another in fear, and you keep hearing that person slinking about outside the door. Everyone would be glad if he finally did come in, but nothing happens, no one comes in. You have to remind yourself that there isn't necessarily any danger. Perhaps it's just someone pacing up and down, wonder, whether to order something and unable to make up his mind. Well, perhaps that's all it is, but perhaps it's something quite different. And the chambermaids don't really know the gentlemen at all. They've hardly set eyes on them. Anyway, the maids inside the room are half dead with fear, and when at last it's quiet again outside, they lean against the wall without even enough strength to get back into bed. And that was the life waiting for Peppy. This very evening, she said she was to move back to her old place in the maid's room. And why? Because of Kay and Frida. Back to the life she'd barely escaped. Escaped with Kay's help, to be sure, but also by dint of her own diligent efforts, because the maids on duty down there, even the most fastidious, do tend to neglect themselves. Who would they be prettifying themselves for? No one sees them, at most the kitchen staff. Well, maybe a maid who's satisfied with that will prettify herself. But otherwise they are in their little room, or in the gentlemen's rooms, and again it would be silly and a waste of time to enter those rooms in neat, clean clothes, and you're always in artificial light and stuffy air. The heating is always on, and always dead tired. The best way to spend your one free afternoon a week is to find some quiet place near the kitchen where you can sleep undisturbed and without fear. So why make yourself pretty? You hardly bother even to dress. And then Peppy was suddenly moved to the bar where the very opposite was necessary if you wanted to hold your ground, where you were always before other people's eyes, those people including some very finicky and observant gentlemen, and where you must always look as fine and pleasant as possible. Well, that was a great change, and Peppy might boast that she left nothing undone. How things turned out later didn't worry Peppy. She knew she had the abilities necessary for the job, she was sure of it, she is still convinced of it now, and no one can take that conviction away from her. Even today, the day of her defeat, the only difficult bit was knowing how to prove herself at first, because she was a poor chambermaid without nice clothes and jewelry, and the gentlemen don't have the patience to hang about and see how you grow into the job. They want a proper barmaid at once, without any in-between period, or they'll go somewhere else. You might think their demands weren't very great if Frida could satisfy them, but that wasn't so. Peppy had often thought about it, she said, had often been in Frida's company, even shared a bed with her for a while. It wasn't easy to make Frida out, and anyone who didn't study her very closely, and what gentleman is going to study a barmaid very closely, would easily be led astray. No one knows better than Frida herself how pathetic she looks. For instance, when you first see her let her hair down, you clasp your hands in pity. A girl like that ought not really to be even a chamber maid. She knows it too, and she has cried her eyes out over it many a night, pressing close to Peppy and winding Peppy's hair around her own head. But when she was serving in the bar, all her doubts were gone. She considered herself a beauty and knew how to make everyone think so too. She knows what people are like, that's her real art. And she is a quick liar and deceptive so that people don't have time to look at her more closely. Of course that won't work forever. People do have eyes, and after all their eyes would tell them the truth. But when Frida realized there was a danger of that, she had something else up her sleeve, most recently, for instance, her relationship with Clam. Her relationship with Clam. If you don't believe me, you can go to Clam and ask him, said Peppy. How clever, how cunning. And if you daren't go to see Clam on that kind of subject, maybe you wouldn't be let in to see him on far more important business. If Clam is entirely inaccessible, though only to you and your like, because Frida, for instance, can pop in and see him whenever she wants. Well, if that's the case, you still can find out. You'd think you only had to wait. Clam wouldn't allow such a false rumor to circulate for long. He really likes to know what's said about him in the bar and the guest rooms. All that is very important to him, and if it's false, he'll soon put it right. But he hasn't put it right, so people think. There's nothing to put right, and it is the truth. What you see is only Frida taking the beer to Clam's room and coming out again with the payment, but Frida tells you what you haven't seen, and you have to believe her. Although in fact she doesn't tell you, she wouldn't reveal such mysteries. No, the secrets spread of their own accord around her, and once they've spread, she doesn't shrink from speaking of them herself, but in a modest way, without claiming anything, just referring to what's common knowledge. Not to everything, for instance, not that Clam drank less beer than before since she was serving in the bar, not much less, but distinctly less. She doesn't talk about that, and there could be various reasons. It could be that a time came when Clam didn't like beer so much, or that Frida made him forget about drinking beer. Anyway, surprising as it may be, let's say Frida was Clam's mistress. But if someone is good enough for Clam, why wouldn't others admire her too? So Frida became a great beauty just like that, the kind of girl that's needed in the bar, almost too beautiful, too powerful. Soon the bar would hardly be enough for her. And sure enough, it seems strange to people that she was still in the bar. It's a great thing to be a bar maid, and from that point of view, her connection with Clam seemed very credible. But if the barmaid is Clam's mistress, why did he leave her in the bar for so long? Why didn't he promote her to better things? You can tell people 1,000 times that there was nothing contradictory about this, that Clam had his reasons for acting in such a way, or that sometime, perhaps very soon, Frida's promotion would come. None of that had much effect. People get certain ideas, and in the long term they won't be persuaded otherwise, not by any arts. No one doubted that Frida was Clam's lover. Even those who obviously knew better were too tired to doubt. For heaven's sake, call yourself Clam's lover then, they thought. But if you really are, will notice by your rise in the world. However, no one noticed anything, and Frida stayed in the bar as before and was secretly very glad to stay there. But she lost face with other people. She couldn't help noticing that. Of course she does notice things, usually even before they've happened. A really beautiful, attractive girl, once she's become used to working in the bar, doesn't have to employ any arts. As long as she's beautiful, she will be a barmaid unless something especially unfortunate happens. A girl like Frida, however, must always be anxious about her job. Of course, she doesn't show it in any obvious way. She's more likely to complain and curse the job. But in secret, she keeps observing the atmosphere. So she saw how people were getting indifferent to her. It wasn't worth looking up when Frida came in. Even the servants didn't bother about her anymore. They understandably stuck to Olga and girls like that. And she noticed the behavior of the landlord and saw that she was nowhere near so indispensable anymore. She couldn't always be making up new stories about Clam. There are limits to everything, so dear Frida thought up something new. Who would have seen through it from the first? Well, Peppy had guessed, but unfortunately hadn't seen right through it. Frida decides on a scan. Dal. She, Clam's lover, will throw herself at the first man who comes along, perhaps someone totally insignificant. That will attract attention. People will talk about that for a long time, and at last they'll remember what it means to be Clam's lover, what it means to cast aside that honor in the frenzy of a new love. The only difficult part was finding a suitable man with whom she could play this clever game. Couldn't be anyone Frida knew already, not even one of the servants. He would probably have stared at her wide-eyed and gone away, and above all, he wouldn't have taken it seriously. However much he might talk, it would have been impossible to spread the story that Frida had been attacked by him, hadn't been able to defend herself, and in a crazy moment had fallen for him. And if it was to be someone very insignificant, it had to be someone of whom it could credibly be believed that in spite of his blunt, elegant manners, he longed only for Frida, of all people, and had no greater desire than, for heaven's sake, to marry her. But if it was to be a low, vulgar man, if possible even lower, much lower than a servant, it should be someone who wouldn't have every other girl mocking her, someone by whom another girl capable of good judgment might perhaps be attracted. But where would you find a man like that? Another girl might have sought him in vain for a lifetime, but Frida's luck brings the land surveyor to her in the bar, perhaps on the very evening when the idea first comes into her mind. The land surveyor. Yes, what was Kay thinking of? What strange ideas did he have in his head? Did he want to achieve something in particular? A good appointment? A distinction? Did he want something of that kind? Well, then he should have gone about it differently from the start. He is nothing. It is pitiful to see his position. He is a land surveyor. Well, perhaps that is something. He has trained at something. But if there's nothing you can do with that training, then it means nothing. And he was making claims without anything at all to support them, not making them straight out, but you noticed that he was making claims of some kind, and that was provocative. Does he know that even a chambermaid is losing face if she talks to him for any length of time? And with all these special claims, he falls into the most obvious trap on the very first evening. Isn't he ashamed of himself? What did he see in Frida? He could admit it now. Could that thin, sallow creature really have appealed to him? Oh no, he didn't even look at her. She just told him that she was Clam's lover. That was interesting news to him, and he was lost. But now she had to move out. Now, of course, there was no job for her at the Castle Inn. Peppy saw her the morning before she moved out. The staff had gathered. Everyone was curious to see the sight, and her power was still so great that they were sorry for her. All of them, even her enemies, were sorry for her. So well did her calculations work out at first. Seemed unthinkable to everyone that she'd thrown herself away on a man like that. What a blow of fate. The little kitchen maids, who of course admire any barmaid, were inconsolable. Even Peppy was moved. Not even she could entirely arm herself against pity, although her attention was really elsewhere. She noticed how little sadness Frida actually showed. After all, it was fundamentally a terrible misfortune that had befallen her, and she acted as if she were very unhappy. But that game wasn't enough to deceive Peppy. So what kept her going? The joy of her new love. Perhaps that idea could be dismissed. What was it then? What gave her the strength to be as coolly friendly as always, even to Peppy, who was already regarded as her successor? At the time, Peppy didn't have the leisure to think about it. She had too much to do with preparing to take up her new post. She ought really to be beginning work within a few hours, and she didn't have a smart hairstyle yet, or an elegant dress, or fine underwear, or a good pair of shoes. All those things had to be found within a few hours, and if she couldn't equip herself properly, it would be better not to accept the post at all, for she'd be sure to lose it again in the first half hour. Well, she partly succeeded in her aims. She had a special talent for hairdressing. Once the landlady had even moaned her to do the landlady's hair. The fact is that she has a very light hand and can arrange her own wealth of hair just as she likes. There was help at hand over the dress too. Her colleagues were still friendly with her, for it was a kind of honor to them too if a girl from their group was promoted to barmaid, and Peppy could have gained them many advantages later once she had real power. One of the girls had a length of expensive dress material. It was her great treasure. She had often got the others to admire it, probably dreamed of using it for herself in some very fine way one day, and now that Peppy needed it, she gave it up. It was so kind of her. And the two other girls were happy to help her with the sewing. They couldn't have worked harder if they'd been making the dress for themselves. It was actually very cheerful and pleasant work. They all sat on their beds, one above the other, sewing and singing, and handed the finished pieces and the trimmings up and down to each other. When Peppy thinks of that, her heart is all the heavier to know that it was all in vain, and she would return to her friends, the chambermaids, empty-handed. What a misfortune, and brought about with such thoughtlessness, above all by Kay. How glad they had been about that dress at the time. It seemed the guarantee of success, and when room was found for yet another ribbon later, the last doubts disappeared. And isn't the dress really lovely? It is creased and a little stained now. Peppy didn't have a spare dress. She'd had to wear this one day and night, but you can still see how beautiful it is. Not even those dreadful sisters of Barnabas could come up with a better one. And then you can take it in or let it out again as you like. Above and below, it may be only a dress, but it's an advantage that it can be so easily altered, and that was really her own idea. Sewing isn't difficult for her. Peppy isn't boasting of that, and anything will suit a healthy young girl. It was much harder to get underwear and good boots, and here the trouble really began. Once again her friends helped as well as they could, but there wasn't much they could do. They came up with only coarse, mended underwear, and instead of ankle boots with high heels, she had to wear slippers that you would rather hide than show. People comforted Peppy by saying that Frida wasn't very well dressed herself, and sometimes she went around looking such a sloven that the guests would rather be served by the lads from the cellar than the barmaid. Those were the facts of the matter, but Frida could get away with it because she was in favor and highly regarded. If a lady happens to go out looking dirty and carelessly dressed for once, she is all the more enticing, but a beginner like Peppy, and anyway Frida, couldn't dress well. She had no taste at all. If someone has a sallow skin, she can't do much about that, but she doesn't have to wear a low-cut cream blouse against it like Frida so that your eyes watered from looking at all that yellow. And even if that hadn't been so, she was too mean to dress well. She kept everything she earned. No one knew what for. She didn't need money in the job. She made use of lies and tricks instead. She set an example that Peppy couldn't and wouldn't follow. And so it was right for her, Peppy, to prettify herself, so that she could make her mark at the very outset. If only she had more funds to do it with, she'd have defeated Frida in spite of all her slyness and all Kay's folly. And it began so well. She had found out the few skills you had to master and the things you had to know in advance. As soon as she began work in the bar, she was quite at home there. No one missed Frida. It was only on the second day that some of the guests asked what had become of her. There were no mistakes. The landlord was satisfied. He had been so anxious on the first day that he was in and out of the bar all the time. Later he came only now and then, and in the end, since the takings were right, in fact the bar was taking on average a little more money than in Frida's time, he left everything to Peppy. She introduced innovations. Frida had supervised everyone strictly, not out of industry, but out of avarice, out of her desire to dominate and her fear of letting someone else have any of her rights. She supervised even the servants, at least in part, especially when someone was watching. Peppy, on the other hand, left that work entirely to the cellar lads, who were much better suited to it. That meant she had more time for the gentlemen's rooms, the guests were served quickly, and she could exchange a few words with someone, not like Frida, who apparently kept herself entirely for Clam and considered every word or approach from someone else an insult to him. That was clever too, to be sure, for if she ever did let someone approach her, it was an unheard of favor. But Peppy hated such tricks, and you can't use them to start with in a job either. Peppy was friendly to everyone, and everyone was friendly to her in return. They were all obviously glad of the change. When those tired, overworked gentlemen can finally sit over their beer for a while, you can positively transform them with a word, a glance, a shrug of your shoulders. Everyone liked to run his hands through Peppy's curls. She probably had to tidy her hair 10 times a day. No one could resist the allure of those curls and the bows in her hair, not even Kay, who usually noticed nothing much. So those exciting, hardworking but successful days flew by. If only they hadn't flown so fast. If only there had been more of them left. For days are not enough when you're working yourself to the bone. Perhaps the 5th day would have done the trick, but 4 days were too few. Peppy had indeed won friends and patrons in those 4 days. If she could trust the glances of all eyes, she had been positively swimming in a sea of goodwill as she walked around with the beer tank. A clerk called Bratmeyer is crazy about her. She says he gave her this chain and locket with his picture in the locket, which was certainly very bold of him. This, that, and the other had happened, but it was still only 4 days. In 4 days, if Peppy had put her mind to it, Frida could have been almost if not entirely forgotten, and she would have been forgotten too, perhaps even earlier, if she hadn't made sure to keep people talking about her by creating such a scandal. It had made her interesting to them again. They wanted to see her, merely out of curiosity. What had become dreadfully dreary had fresh interest because of Kay, to whom they were otherwise entirely indifferent. They wouldn't have lost interest in Peppy because of that, not while she was standing here physically present to them. But the gentlemen are mostly elderly and set in their ways. It takes them some time to get used to a new barmaid, however much the change is for the better, but it will take a few days, even if it's against the gentlemen's real will. It's going to take a few days, perhaps only 5, but for are not enough. Peppy still seemed like the temporary barmaid in spite of everything. And then there was perhaps the greatest of misfortunes. In those 4 days, Clam, although he had been in the village for the first 2 of them, had not come down to the guest room next door. If he had come, that would have been a crucial test for Peppy, and a test she didn't fear at all. Indeed, she was looking forward to it. She would not, to be sure, it is better not to put such things into words. She would not have become Clam's lover, and would never have told lies elevating herself to such a position, but she would at least have been able to put the beer glass on the table just as nicely as Frida. She would have said a nice good day without any of Frida's pushy manner, and she would have taken her leave prettily too. And if Clam was looking for anything at all in a girl's eyes, well, he'd have found it in Peppy's to his full satisfaction. But why didn't he come? Was it pure chance? Peppy had thought so at the time. She was expecting him at any moment during those first 2 days. She waited for him to appear at night too. Now Clam will arrive, she kept on thinking, pacing up and down for no reason other than the agitation of waiting and the wish to be the first to see him come in. This constant disappointment tired her out, and perhaps for that reason she didn't achieve as much as she could have done. When she had a little time, she stole out into the corridor that the staff were strictly forbidden to enter, huddled in a niche there, and waited. If only Clam would come now, she thought, if only I could take that gentleman out of his room myself and carry him down to the guest room in my arms. I wouldn't collapse under the burden, however great it was. But he didn't come. It's so quiet in those corridors. Upstairs, Peppy said, you can't imagine how quiet if you haven't been there. It's so quiet that you can't stand it for long. The silence drives you away. But again and again, driven away 10 times, Peppy climbed up there again 10 times. There was no point in it. The clam wanted to come down, he would come, and if he didn't want to come down, Peppy wouldn't lure him out, even if she was half choked in the niche by the palpitations of her heart. There was no point in it, but if he didn't come, there was no point in almost anything. And he didn't come. Today Peppy knows why Clam didn't come. Frida would have been much amused if she had seen Peppy in the niche up in that corridor, both hands to her heart. Clam didn't come down because Frida wouldn't let him. It wasn't her requests that had won the day. Her requests carried no weight with Clam. But that spider in her web has connections that nobody knows about. If Peppy says something to a guest, she says it openly. They can hear her at the table next to the guests too. Frida has nothing to say, she just puts the beer down on the table and walks away with only her silk petticoat rustling. It's the one thing she will pay good money for. And if she does say something for once, she doesn't say it openly. She whispers to the guest, bending down so that they have to prick up their ears at the next table. Whatever she says is probably unimportant, but not always. She has connections, keep some of them going through the others, and while most of them fail her, well, who would bother about Frida in the long run? Now and then one will hold firm. So she began exploiting these connections. Kay gave her the opportunity for that. Instead of staying with her and keeping watch on her, he hardly goes home at all. He wanders around, talks to this person, and that watches out for everything except for Frida, and finally, giving her yet more freedom, he moves from the bridge into the empty schoolhouse. That's a fine start to a honeymoon. Well, Peppy is certainly the last woman to blame Kay for not being able to stand life with Frida. No one can stand life with Frida. But why didn't he leave her entirely then? Why did he keep going back to her? Why did his wandering about give the impression that he was championing her? It looked as if only contact with Frida had shown him how little he really meant, as if he wanted to make himself worthy of Frida, as if he somehow wanted to work his way up, and so, for the time being, held back from living with her so that later, in his own good time, he could make up for it. Meanwhile, Frida is not wasting time. She sits in the school to which she has probably been instrumental in bringing Kay, keeping watch on the Castle Inn and Kate too. She has excellent messengers to hand, Kay's assistants, whom he leaves entirely to her. It is hard to understand that even if you know Kay, you really can't understand it. She sends them to her old friends, reminds them of what has happened, complains that she is kept captive by a man like Kay, stirs up bad feeling against Peppy, announces that she'll be back any day now, asks for help, tells her friends not to say a word to Clam, acts as if Clam must be spared, and so in no circumstances can he be allowed down into the bar. While she pretends to some that she is just being thoughtful for Clam, she exploits her success with the landlord by pointing out that Clam is not coming down there anymore. How could he, when there's only a girl like Peppy serving in the bar? Of course the landlord isn't to blame, says Frida. Peppy was just the best substitute he could find, only she's not good enough, even for a few days. Kay knows nothing about all this intriguing on Frida's part. If he isn't out and about, he's lying at her feet. Suspect, NG nothing, while she counts the hours that still lie between her and her return to the bar. But the assistants don't just act as messengers. They also serve to make Kay jealous, to keep him on the boil. Frida has known the assistants since her childhood. They certainly have no secrets from each other, but for Kay's benefit they start making eyes at each other, and Kay is in danger of assuming it's a great love. And Kay does all he can to please Frida, however contradictory it may be. He lets the assistants make him jealous, but he allows the three of them to stay together while he goes off on long walks on his own, almost as if he were Frida's third assistant. So on the grounds of what she's observed, Frida decides on her masterstroke. She decides to come back, and it is high time too. It's remarkable how that cunning girl Frida recognizes and exploits that fact. Her power of observation and decision is Frida's special skill. If Peppy had it, how different would her own life be? If Frida had stayed at the school just 1 or 2 days longer, Peppy couldn't have been driven away. She would have been the established barmaid at last, liked and loved by one and all. She'd have earned enough money to complete her wardrobe and fit herself out brilliantly another 2 or 3 days. And no tricks could have kept Clam away from the bar. Oh yes, he comes in, he drinks, he feels comfortable, and if he notices Frida's absence at all, he is very happy about the change. Another 2 or 3 days and Frida, with her scandalous behavior, with her tie-ins, with the assistants, with everything else, would be utterly forgotten. She would never surface again. Then would she perhaps cling all the more firmly to Kay, and at last learn to love him truly, assuming that she is capable of such a thing? No, not that either, for it wouldn't take Kay more than a day to tire of her, to realize how shamefully she is deceiving him in every way, with her supposed beauty, her supposed constancy, most of all with her supposed love. For Clam, only 1 day is all he'd need to chase her and those filthy assistants out of the house. You might think that not even Kay would need longer. And then, between those 2 dangers where the ground positively seems to be closing over Frida, Kay in his foolishness keeps the last way of escape open for her, a narrow one, and she takes it. Suddenly, hardly anyone expected it anymore. It is unnatural. Suddenly it is she chasing away Kay, who still loves her, still follows her, and with the help of pressure from friends and assistants she looks to the landlord like a savior, more enticing than before because of her scandalous behavior, evidently desired by the lowest and the highest alike, and she fell for the lowest only briefly, soon rejected him again as was only proper, and she is now out of his reach and everyone else's as in the old days, except that in the old days doubt, quite correctly, was cast on all that, but now her status seems to be confirmed. So she comes back. The landlord glances surreptitiously at Peppy and hesitates. Is he to sacrifice her after she has proved her worth so well? But soon he's been persuaded. There's too much in Frida's favor, and above all she will bring Clam back to the guest room. And that's what this evening is all about. Peppy isn't going to wait until Frida comes back and makes taking over the job again into a scene of triumph. She's already handed the cash register over to the landlady. She can go. Her bunk bed down in the maid's room is ready for her. She will go there to be greeted by her friends. In tears, will take the dress off her body and the ribbons out of her hair and stuff it all in a corner where it will be well hidden and won't unnecessarily remind her of times that are better forgotten. Then she will pick up the big bucket and the broom, grit her teeth and set to work. But for now she simply had to tell Kay everything so that he, who wouldn't have understood all this yet without any help, will just for once see clearly how badly he has treated Peppy and how unhappy he has made her, although in fact he too has merely been misused. Peppy had finished what she had to say. She mopped a few tears from her eyes and cheeks and then looked at Kay, nodding as if to say it wasn't really her own misfortune that troubled her. She would bear it and didn't need help or consolation from anyone, least of all Kay. In spite of her youth, she knew life, and her unhappiness just confirmed what she knows. No, this was about Kay. She wanted to hold his own picture up to him even after the collapse of all her own hopes. She thought she ought to do that. What a wild imagination you have, Peppy, said Kay. Why, it's not true that you have discovered all these things only now. They're not but dreams from the dark, cramped room you and the other chambermaids share. They may be in place there, but they look strange here in the open, in the bar. You couldn't have held your ground here with such notions, that's obvious. Even your dress and your hairstyle, on which you pride yourself so much, are just the fantastic outcome of that darkness and those beds in your room. I am sure they look very attractive there, but here everyone laughs at them, whether secretly or openly. And what else do you say? You say, I have been misused and betrayed? No, dear Peppy, I haven't been misused and betrayed any more than you have. It is true that at present Frida has left me, or as you put it, has run off with one of the assistants, so you have hit upon some idea of the facts, and it is really very unlikely that she will be my wife now, but it is entirely untrue to say that I tired of her or chased her away next day, or that she betrayed me as a woman might usually betray a man. You chamber maids are used to spying through keyholes, which means that when you really do see some small thing, it leads you to draw grand but erroneous conclusions about the whole picture. The result is that I, for instance, know much less than you claim to know, cannot explain in nearly as much detail as you do why Frida has left me. It seems to me that you have also touched on the most probable explanation, although you didn't make much of it. I neglected her. I am afraid that's true, I have indeed neglected her, but there were particular reasons for that which it is not right to mention here. I would be happy if she came back to me, but I would begin neglecting her again at once, and that's how it is. When she was with me, I was always out and about on those wanderings you ridicule. Now that she's gone, I have almost nothing to do. I am tired. I long to be even more entirely unoccupied. Have you no advice for me, Peppy? Oh yes, said Peppy, suddenly becoming lively and taking hold of K.'s shoulders. We've both been betrayed. Let's stay together. Come down to the other maids with me. I can't talk to you sensibly while you complain of being betrayed, said K. You keep saying you were betrayed because the idea touches you and flatters you. But the truth is that you are not suitable for this position. If even I, who in your opinion know not, see that unsuitability, then it must be very obvious. You are a good girl, Peppy, but it isn't easy to see that. I, for instance, thought you cruel and arrogant at first, which you aren't. It is just this post that bewilders you because you're not suitable for it. I don't mean to say it is too elevated for you. It is nothing so very out of the ordinary. Or perhaps, looking at it closely, its status is a little higher than your previous job, but on the whole there is no great difference. The two are very similar. In fact, one might almost say that to be a chamber maid is better than working in the bar, for the chambermaids are always among the secretaries, while here, even if you may serve the secretary's superiors in the guest rooms, you must also meet very common folk, for instance me. It is right and proper that I can't go anywhere else in the inn, only be here in the bar, and is the possible ity of meeting me such a great distinction? Well, it seems so to you, and perhaps you have your reasons, but that is just why you are unsuitable. Although this is a job like any other, to you it seems like heaven, and as a result you do everything with excessive enthusiasm. You deck yourself out as you think the angels are adorned, although they are really not at all like that. You tremble for your post. You feel persecuted the whole time. You try to win over everyone who you think might be able to support you, showing far too much friendliness, but that is a nuisance to them and puts them off, for they want peace when they come to the inn, not to add the barmaids' troubles to their own. It's possible that after Frida left none of the distinguished guests really noticed, but today they do, and they really long to have Frida back, I suppose because she ran everything very differently. Whatever else she may be like, and however she valued her post, she was experienced at serving the guests, cool and control, led, as you say yourself, but you don't profit by her example. Did you ever notice the expression in her eyes? It was not the expression of a barmaid, but almost of a landlady. She saw everything, every detail, and the way she looked at an individual was enough to subdue him. What did it matter that she may have been a little thin, not as young as she once was, that a girl can have thicker hair? Those are all small details compared to what she really did have, and anyone troubled by those flaws would just have shown that he lacked a sense of better things. No such accusation can be leveled against Clam, and it is only a young, inexperienced girl's viewpoint that makes you believe Clam couldn't have loved Frida. Clam seems to you, and correctly, out of reach, and so you think that Frida couldn't have been close to Clam either. You are wrong. I would trust Frida's word alone for that, even if I didn't have incontrovertible evidence of. Incredible as it seems to you, and little as you can reconcile it with your ideas of the world and the life of the officials of distinction and the effect of female beauty, it is true as we're sitting here together and I take your hand between mine. No doubt that is how Clam and Frida sat side by side too, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and he came down here of his own free will. Indeed, he hurried down. No one was lying in wait for him in the sore rider and neglecting the rest of her work. Clam had to come down of his own accord, and the deficiencies of Frida's clothing that have horrified you so much didn't trouble him at all. You just don't want to believe her, and you don't know how you are exposing yourself, because it shows your inexperience. Even someone who knew nothing about her relationship with Clam must notice that of its very nature it left its mark on someone above you and me and all the other people in the village, and that their conversations went beyond the usual sort of joking between guests and waitresses, which seems to be the whole aim of your life. But I am doing you an injustice. You know Frida's advantages very well yourself. You notice her gift for observation, her power of decision, her influence over other people. Only you interpret it all in the wrong way. You think that she uses all that selfishly for her own benefit and with bad intentions, or even as a weapon against you. No, Peppy, even if she did hold such arrows in her hand, she couldn't shoot them such a short way. And selfish? One might rather say that by sacrificing what she had and what she could expect, she gave us both, you and me, an opportunity to rise higher, but that we have disappointed her and have positively forced her to come back here. I don't know whether that is so, and I am not quite clear how I am to blame, but when I compare myself with you, thing of the kind does appear before me. It is as if we both tried too hard, too noisily, too childishly, and with too little experience to gain something that can easily and quietly be had with, for instance, Frida's calm and Frida's objectivity. But we tried to get it by and scratching and tugging, just as a child tugs at the tablecloth, but cannot get it, merely sweeps all the beautiful things off the table, and puts them out of reach forever. I don't know if that is the case, but I do know for certain that it is more likely than your version of events. I see, said Peppy. You're in love with Frida because she ran away from you. It's not difficult to be in love with her when she's not around. But even if it's as you claim, and even if you are right about everything, including making me look ridiculous, what are you going to do now? Frida has left you. Neither my explanation nor yours gives you any hope of her coming back to you, and even if she did, you have to spend the time in between somewhere. It's cold weather and you have neither work nor a bed. So come to us, you'll, like my friends, will make you comfortable. You can help us with our work, which really is too hard for girls on their own. We girls won't have to rely entirely on ourselves and feel afraid at night. Do come and join us. My girlfriends know Frida too, will tell you stories of her until you're sick and tired of them. Do come. We have pictures of Frida as well. We'll show you those. Frida was even less striking then than now. You'll hardly recognize her except from her eyes, which had a sly look even then. Well, will you come? Is that allowed? Yesterday it was a great scandal when I was caught in your corridor. That's because you were caught, but if you are with us, you won't be caught. No one will know about you, only the three of us. Oh, what fun it will be. My life there already seems to me more bearable than it did a little while ago. Perhaps I'm not losing so very much by having to leave the job here after all. You know, even with the three of us we weren't bored. You have to sweeten the bitterness of life. It's made bitter for us in our youth so that our tongues don't get used to luxury, but we three stick together, we live as nice a life as possible. You'll especially like Henriette and Emily too. I've already told them about you. People listen to such tales and marvel as if nothing could happen outside our room. It's warm if cramped in there, and we keep close together, even though we have only each other to rely on. We don't get tired of one another. On the contrary, when I think of my girlfriends, I almost feel it's all right to be going back there. Why should I rise higher than them? That was what kept us together, all three of us having the future barred to us in the same way. And then I broke out and was separated from them, but the fact is I didn't forget them, and my next concern was how I could do something for them. My own position was still uncertain, though I didn't know just how uncertain, and already I was talking to the landlord about Henriette and Emily. The landlord wasn't entirely inflexible in Henriette's case, but as for Emily, who is much older than the two of us, she's about Frida's age, he could give me no hope there. But just think, they don't want to leave. They know it's a wretched life they lead there, but they've adjusted to it, good souls. I believe their tears when I said goodbye were mostly grief, because I had to leave the room we shared and go out into the cold. In our room, everything outside, it seems to us, cold, and I'd have to go around in those great strange rooms with those great strange people for no purpose but to earn a living, though I'd done that before when we lived and worked together. They probably won't be surprised to see me coming back, and they'll cry a little and bemoan my fate just to oblige me, but then they'll see you and realize that it was a good thing I left after all. It will make them happy to know that now we have a man to help and protect us, and they'll be positively delighted that it all has to be kept secret, and the secret will bind us even more closely together than before. Come and join us. Oh, do please come and join us. There's no obligation on you. You won't be bound to the room forever as we are. When spring comes, if you find somewhere else to stay and you don't like it with us anymore, you can go, only you'll still have to keep the secret and not give us away, because that would be the end of us at the Castle Inn. And of course, if you're with us, you must be careful not to show yourself anywhere that we don't consider safe, and to follow our advice. That's all the obligation you have, and you will have to put up with it just as we do, but otherwise you're entirely free. The work we give you to do won't be too hard. Don't be afraid of that. Well, will you come? How long is it until spring? Asked Kay. Until spring? Peppy repeated. Oh, winter here is long. A very long, monotonous winter. But we don't complain of that down there. We're safe there from the winter. Well, sometime spring will come, and summer too, and they have their own time, but now, as we remember them, spring and summer seem as short as if they weren't much more than 2 days long, and even on those days, snow sometimes falls in the middle of the finest weather. The door opened. Peppy jumped. In her thoughts, she had moved too far from the bar. But it wasn't Frida, it was the landlady. She seemed surprised to find Kay still here. Kay excused himself by saying that he had been waiting for her, and at the same time he thanked her for letting him spend the night here. The landlady didn't understand why Kay had been waiting for her. Kay said he had had the impression that the landlady wanted to speak to him. He asked her pardon if that had been a mistake, and anyway he must go now. He had been away from the school where he was janitor far too long. Yesterday's some Mons had been to blame for everything. He still had too little experience in these things. He said he certainly wouldn't make as much trouble for the landlady again as he had yesterday, and he bowed, ready to go. But the landlady stared at him with a look in her eyes as if she were dreaming. That look of hers kept Kay there longer than he wanted. Then she smiled a little too, and only at Kay's expression of amazement did she wake up to some extent. It was as if she had been waiting for a response to her smile, but now, when none came, she woke up. You had the impudence to say something about my dress yesterday. Kay couldn't remember that. Don't you remember? You're not only impudent but cowardly too. Then Kay explained that it was due to his weariness yesterday. It was possible, he said, that he had talked about something or other, but he couldn't remember it. Now, what could he have been saying about the good landladies? Dresses? That they were more beautiful than any dresses he had ever seen? Or at least, he had never seen a landlady go about her work in such dresses before. Never mind passing personal remarks, said the landlady quickly. I don't want to hear another word from you about my dresses. My dresses are none of your business. I forbid you to mention them, and that's that. Kay bowed again and went to the door. What do you mean anyway? Called the landlady after him. What do you mean? You never saw a landlady go about her work in such dresses before? Why say such pointless things? What could be more pointless? What do you mean by it? Kay turned back and asked the landlady not to upset herself. Of course his remark was pointless, he said. He really didn't know anything about dresses. In his situation, any clean dress that didn't need mending seemed to him very fine. He had just been surprised, he said, to see the landlady therein. The corridor at night in such a beautiful evening dress among all those half-clothed men, that was all. Well, said the landlady at last, you seem to remember what you said yesterday, and you compound your impertinence with yet more nonsense. It is true that you know nothing about dresses, so let me earnestly beg you, kindly desist from passing remarks on fine dresses and what they are like, or about unsuitable evening dresses or anything of the kind. And anyway, here a shudder seemed to pass through her. You are not to pay any attention to my dresses, do you hear? And when Kay was about to turn away again in silence, she asked, where did you get your knowledge of dresses then? Kay shrugged his shoulders to show that he didn't know. Well, you have none, said the landlady, so don't make out that you do. Come over to the office and I'll show you something, and then I hope you will leave off your impudence forever. She went ahead through the door. Peppy ran to Kay. On the excuse that she wanted Kay to pay what he owed, they quickly came to an agreement. It was very easy, since Kay knew the yard with the gate leading into the side street. There was a little gate beside the big one, and Peppy would be waiting on the other side of that in an hour's time and open it. When he knocked 3 times, the private office of the inn was opposite the bar. There was only the front hall to cross. The landlady was already standing in the lighted office, looking impatiently at Kay. But there was one distraction. Jerstacker had been waiting in the hall and wanted to speak to Kay. It wasn't easy to shake him off. The landlady joined in too, point ng out to Jerstacker that he was intruding. Where do I wait, then? Where do I wait? Jerstacker could be heard calling as the door was closed, and his words were mingled unappealingly with sighing and coughing. The office was a small, overheated room. A lectern desk stood by one of the shorter walls and an iron safe too, while a wardrobe and an ottoman stood by the longer walls. The wardrobe took up most of the space. Not only did it extend along the whole of one long wall, but its depth made the room very cramped, and 3 sliding doors were necessary to open it completely. The landlady pointed to the ottoman, indicating that Kay should sit down on it, and she herself sat on the swiveling chair by the lectern. Haven't you ever trained as a tailor and dressmaker? Asked the landlady. No, never, said Kay. What's your profession, then? I'm a land surveyor. What's that? Kay told her, but the explanation made her yawn. You're not telling the truth. Why don't you tell the truth? You're not telling the truth. Either. There you go again with your impudence. And suppose I wasn't telling it. Do I have to justify myself to you? Anyway, in what way am I not telling the truth? You are not just a landlady, as you make out. Well, you're very sharp, I'm sure. What else am I, then? Your impertinence is really too much. I don't know what else you are. I see only that you appear to be a landlady, but you wear dresses that don't suit a landlady, and as far as I know, no one here in the village wears anything like them. So now we're coming to it. You can't deny it. Perhaps you aren't impudent at all, perhaps you're just like a child who knows some silly joke and can't be brought to. Keep it quiet. So out with it. What's so special about those dresses? You'll be angry if I tell you. No, I shall laugh because it will be just childish nonsense. So what are my dresses like? Well, you did ask. They are made of good fabric, expensive dress material, but they are old-fashioned, over-trimmed, often too elaborately made. They are wearing out, and they suit neither your years nor your figure nor your position. I noticed them as soon as I first set eyes on you, about a week ago in the front hall here, so now we have it. They are old-fashioned, over-trimmed, and what else was it? And how do you think you know all that? I can see it. One doesn't need any training to know such a thing. You can see it just like that. You don't have to go and ask anywhere. You know at once what fashion demands. You're going to be invaluable to me because I do have a weakness for beautiful dresses. And what will you say when I tell you that this wardrobe is full of them? She pushed the sliding doors aside, and dress upon dress was to be seen hanging close together, the whole breadth and depth of the wardrobe, most of them dark, gray, brown, black dresses, all carefully hung up with their skirts spread. Those are my dresses, all of them old-fashioned and over-trimmed in your opinion. But these are only the dresses I don't have room for in my bedroom. I have 2 more wardrobes full of them upstairs. 2 wardrobes, each almost the size of this one. Are you amazed? No, I expected something of the kind. As I said, you're more than just a landlady. You are aiming for something else. I'm aiming only to dress well, and you are either a fool or a child or a very bad, dangerous man. So go away, hurry up, go away. Kay was out in the hall, and Jerstacker was holding his sleeve again as the landlady called after him. I'm having a new dress delivered tomorrow. Perhaps I'll let you go and fetch it. Jerstacker, angrily waving his hand as if to silence the landlady from a distance because she bothered him, asked Kay to go with him. At first he wouldn't explain why, and he didn't take much notice of Kay's objection that he ought to go to the school now. Only when Kay resisted being dragged off by him did Jerstacker tell him not to worry. He would have everything he needed at his own place. He could give up the post of school janitor, and would he please now come? He'd been waiting for him all day, Jerstacker told him. His mother didn't know where he was. Slowly yielding to his demands, Kay asked how he planned to provide board and lodging for him. Jerstacker just answered briefly, saying he needed Kay to help with the horses. He himself had other business now, and he wished Kay didn't have to be dragged along like this, making unnecessary difficulties for him. If Kay wanted payment, then he, Jerstacker, would give him payment. But for all his tugging, Kay stopped dead now. He didn't know anything about horses, he said. That didn't matter, said Jerstacker impatiently, and in his irate state of mind he actually clasped his hands pleadingly to persuade Kay to go with him. I don't know why you want me to come with you, Kay said at last. It was all one to Jerstacker what Kay knew. Is it because you think that I can bring influence to bear on Erlanger for you? That's right, said Jerstacker. Why else would I be interested in you? Kay laughed, took Jerstacker's arm, and let the man lead him away through the darkness. The living room in Jerstacker's house was only dimly lit by the fire on the hearth and a candle end. By the light of the latter someone could be seen stooped in a niche under the sloping rafters that stuck out there reading a book. It was Jerstacker's mother. She gave Kay her trembling hand and made him sit down beside her. She spoke with difficulty. It was hard to understand her, but what she said. Explanatory notes. 5 West-Wests. This name has provoked much inconclusive conjecture, usually associating West with decline. 6 Land Surveyor. Erich Heller maintains that the German word Landvermesser alludes to Vermessenheit, hubris, the disinherited mind. Cambridge. Bowes and Bowes, 1951, 169. Though nothing is made of this association in the text. E. Tidbeck notes that the Hebrew word for land surveyor. Mashoa is almost identical with that for Messiah, Kafka, and the Yiddish theater, Madison, Wisk. University of Wisconsin Press, 1971, 195. The possible implications of this are followed out in Richie Robertson, Kafka, Judaism, Politics and Literature, Oxford, Clarendon Press, 1985, 228-35. 8 to the land surveyor now. Here a deleted passage in Kafka's manuscript has Cave seizing his stick and terrifying the peasants. 9 wife and child, not otherwise mentioned. 14 silk. Many figures associated with the castle have clothes that resemble silk. C.F. Barnabas, page 23. The castle and landladies dress that rustled like silk, page 249. And Pepe's dress of shiny gray fabric secured with a silk ribbon, page 89. This person is mentioned later, page 127, and is said to be ill from the air in the village, page 129, but she plays no part in the action. 16 Lazeman. Suggests Czech Lazen, Bath. 17 Gerstacker. The name of a 19th century author of adventure stories. In Richard Shepard's view, it inevitably calls to mind the German word for graveyard, Gottsacker, on Kafka's Castle, a study, London Croom. Helm, 1973, 105. 22 That eternal land surveyor, perhaps alluding to the expression der Ewig. Jude, the wandering Jew, literally the eternal Jew. 23 Barnabas. Though explained in Acts 4 verse 36 as son of consolation, this name more likely means son of the prophet. I am a messenger. In the original, Barnabas inverts subject and object. Barnabas am I called, a messenger am I, in a strange and solemn way. Kafka knew that in Hebrew Malak means messenger and also angel. 27 Clam. Suggests the Czech word clam, illusion. 31 Didn't entice him. At this point Kafka originally had a long and stormy conversation between Kay and Olga, during which Kay, annoyed by Amelia's stare, seized her knitting and threw it on the table. 35 Frida. A very common name, suggesting German Fried, peace. 38 Whip. Frida uses the whip to drive away the bestial servants. Not to provoke lust but to tame it. 40 Song of some kind. At this point in the manuscript Kafka deleted an explicit formulation of K's motives. K was thinking more about Clam than about her. The conquest of Frida required him to change his plans. Here he was getting a powerful instrument which might make it unneeded. Sorry for him to spend any time working in the village. Rubbish. On the juxtaposition of love and filth. C.F. Kafka's letter to Milena of 8 to 9 August 1920, in which he says that his sexual urge had something of the eternal Jew, senselessly being drawn along, senselessly wandering through a senselessly obscene world, yet that in sex there's something of the air breathed in paradise before the fall. Letters to Milena, New York. Schocken, 1990, 148. 42 Fourth Day. That is, if one counts the evening of his arrival as the first day. 50 Those villains. The hostility shown by the villagers here and later to Barnabas and his family is inconsistent with Barnabas's friendly Recep. Tie-in earlier in the saloon bar, page 23. Kafka must have changed his plans for the family without amending his earlier text accordingly. 52 Eagle. Clam is associated with an eagle also in a cancelled passage where Kay says that Clam's sleigh has a golden eagle at the front, but is told by Pepe that it is an ordinary black sleigh like any other. 59 Sordini. Possibly suggested by Italian sordo, deaf. 70 Gardina. An unusual name, possibly suggesting guard with a suffix. Common in Czech female names, e.g. Milena, Rosina. 78 On your own account. The original phrase Auf eigene Faust, which recurs at page 82 of Your Own Accord, may allude to Goethe's Faust, whose Ambitious behavior resembles KS. See Introduction. 89 Pepi. Short for Josephine, an extremely common name in Catholic German-speaking countries. 98 Momus. The Greek god of laughter, that everyone promptly becomes. Serious is a little joke by Kafka. 104 Fire and Brimstone. Cf. Genesis 19 verse 24. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom, and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. 117 Mere children. This confirms that Kay and Frida form a kind of family, with the two assistants as children. 121 To the south of France, to Spain. These real places feel very incongruous with the geographical vagueness of the castle and village. 129 Bitter Rue. Jews are required to eat bitter herbs and unleavened bread at Passover. Numbers 9:11. Combined with Hans's prophecy that in the distant future Cabe will triumph over everyone. Page 133. This may suggest that Kafka at least briefly conceived Kay as liberating the village in the manner of Moses. 144 Warmth of her presence. Schwartzer's feudal devotion to Jesus provides a parallel to K.'s obsession with the castle. 165 Sordini. Possibly suggested by Latin sors, genitive sortis, and its derivative, French sort, fate. July 3rd, Kafka's birthday. 166 Galater. This is the German name for St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, in which Paul opposes the divisions between some Jewish and some non-Jewish Christians. Arnold Heidsieck suggests that such divisions are represented in the novel by the villagers' ostracization of the Barnabas family, and that part of K.'s mission is to unite the village, the intellectual contexts of Kafka's fiction. Columbia, South Carolina. Camden House, 1994, 160-72. 167 Turks. Since the Ottoman Empire formerly controlled large tracts of Eastern Europe and besieged Vienna in 1683, Turks have been proverbial for barbaric enemies. 190 Bertuch. The name of a publisher in Goethe's Weimar, perhaps suggesting German Bartuch, shroud. 206 The Brunette. An inconsistency earlier, both sisters were said to be blonde. Page 31. 209 Erlanger. Suggests German Erlangen, to reach, attain. 225 Burgel. Suggests German Burge, guarantor, cf. Who can guarantee everything. Page 234. Welcome to Audiobook Odyssey, where we bring the magic of literature to your ears. Absolutely free. This channel is dedicated to education and insight, offering key concepts and summaries of books from across genres. Whether you're diving into a timeless classic or discovering something new, we've got you covered. If you'd like to support us, consider buying me a coffee, buying a book, or even sending via UPI. Links are in the description. Don't forget to subscribe and join our growing family of listeners. So, without further delay, let's dive into the ocean of words and begin our journey through the pages of today's featured book.